August 12, 1859 began cool for a river town in late summer. Mist lay along the Missouri before sunrise, a gray band that hid snags and sandbars and the low Iowa shore. By mid-morning the haze had burned away and the river showed its usual color, thick and brown, sliding past the foot of the bluffs in slow folds that carried logs, stumps, and the refuse of steamboats. Wagons rattled down and back from the landing, axles squealing, teams sweating under loads of grain, pork, lumber, and barrels stamped with the marks of merchants from as far east as Chicago. Council Bluffs still felt temporary, as if the weather or the river might sweep it away at any time. But the town had banks, stores, sawmills, and a steady traffic of emigrant trains and freighters. The place already lived off the simple fact that beyond the river there were almost no finished roads at all. The Pacific House Hotel stood on a rise above the main street, a long frame building with a broad porch facing the dust and noise. Its windows were streaked from recent rain, and the railings along the porch were worn smooth by the hands of men who paced there after dinner, or leaned out to watch the teams below. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, sweat, spilled liquor, and boiled meat. A small lobby opened onto a dining room and a bar. Beyond those, private parlors held the town's better conversations, business deals, political arguments, and legal strategy. In one of those parlors, not long after noon, a lanky lawyer from Illinois sat cooling himself after a public address in the courthouse square. Abraham Lincoln had come up the river to Council Bluffs on legal work involving a land and railroad dispute. He had used the trip as an excuse to speak with local Republicans and feel out the temper of the frontier vote. The journey from Illinois had been long and rough. He arrived with his black coat spotted from the river spray, his hat brim bent from use, and his boots marked by the sort of mud that clung to the Missouri banks in every season. The morning speech had left him hoarse, but his mind was still working and he had a list of questions that had nothing to do with the court case. He had spent years reading reports of proposed Pacific railroads, thick volumes filled with tables and elevations, but he had never walked the ground those reports tried to describe. W.H.M. Pusey, banker and local power, sat with Lincoln in the Pacific House parlor. Outside, wagons and riders were visible through the window, moving past in the steady, chaotic procession that filled the town on any fair day. Pusey talked about land values, about the way wagon traffic had grown, about Council Bluffs as the natural staging point for emigrant trains and freight outfits. Lincoln listened, head tilted, long arms looped over his knees. When Pusey repeated the familiar claim that a Pacific railroad should start right where they sat, Lincoln asked a simple question. Who in this town knows the actual country between here and the mountains? Pusey did not hesitate. He named Grenville M. Dodge. Dodge was not in the hotel at that moment. He had spent the morning at his firm's small office, a cramped room above a hardware store a few blocks away, going through survey notes and accounts. The company name, Baldwin and Dodge, painted on the office window in fading letters, covered a mix of work. Dodge helped arrange town lots, handled bridge and road contracts, and drew maps for men who wanted to know where their holdings began and ended. The work paid, but what mattered more to him were the railroad surveys he had been pursuing across Iowa and toward the Missouri for most of the decade. He had been born in Danvers, Massachusetts, and trained in military and civil engineering at Norwich University. After leaving the academy, he headed west as soon as he could, attracted by the new lines that were pushing across prairie and woodland. He had worked for the Illinois Central and the Chicago and Rock Island, among others, walking hundreds of miles with transit and chain, marking grades, testing soils, and watching how crews actually built the lines that appeared as simple strokes on the investors' maps. Those years left him with the habit of looking at any landscape in terms of grades, drainage, timber, stone, and the distance between reliable water sources. When a messenger from Pusey arrived at the office door asking for his presence at the hotel, Dodge put down his pencil, wiped ink from his fingers, and pulled on a clean but worn coat. He walked down the stairway and into the street, stepping around piles of manure and ruts left from yesterday's rain, and then up toward the Pacific House. He moved with the quick, practical stride of a man who spends as much time in the field as at a desk. By the time he reached the hotel lobby, his boots carried a fresh layer of dust. Pusey met him near the foot of the stairs and led him into the parlor. Lincoln rose slightly from his chair, taller than anyone else in the room, even in that half motion. The banker made the introduction in direct language, saying that Dodge had ridden and walked the country between here and the Platte, that he knew as much about the ground to the west as anyone living, and that no better advisor on a Pacific route could be found without sending clear to the Army's survey parties. Dodge and Lincoln shook hands. The engineer noticed the roughness of the lawyer's palms, unusual for a man who lived mostly by pen and brief, and Lincoln noticed the easy steadiness in Dodge's eyes, the marked difference from the flatter look of speculators and town boosters. The conversation began without ornament. Lincoln wanted to know what Dodge had seen and which route he considered best suited for a railroad to the Pacific. Dodge asked to step out to the porch where they could look west toward the river and the open country beyond. On the porch, the air moved a little, cooling shirts, dampened by the afternoon heat. Wagons rattled by below, carrying sacks of grain, barrels of salt pork, planks, and the scant furniture of emigrant families. Men shouted to animals and to each other. Children ran along the edges of the street, kicking up small clouds of dust. Dodge rested one forearm on the rail and pointed past the river bluffs. He said that the road should follow the Platte River Valley. He described in plain terms how the Platte Basin lay, a wide, shallow river with miles of flat bottomland on each side, gentle grades and steady water. He explained that he had ridden that country with his instruments, measuring the rise and fall, testing soils with a shovel blade, watching where snow lay longest and where it melted first. He did not speak as a man repeating the claims of a printed report. He spoke as someone who had counted telegraph pole spacing in his head while riding through a wind that cut across the prairie without obstruction. Lincoln asked what made the Platte superior to the other surveyed routes, including paths northward toward Dakota and southward toward Kansas and the Arkansas River. Dodge answered that the northern routes crossed belts of heavier snowfall and thicker timber, where each mile of line would require more clearing and where snowdrifts could bury the track for weeks each winter. The southern alternatives, he said, wound through more broken country and risked long stretches without easy water. The Platte route, starting from Council Bluffs, offered long, smooth grades that a freight train could climb without helper engines in a climate that still punished men and animals, but did not shut the road down for months at a time. He went on to talk about the Missouri itself. Council Bluffs sat opposite an uncertain, shifting river that froze hard in winter and filled with ice flows in spring. The town relied on steamboats that could be delayed for days by low water or storms. Dodge argued that this unreliability made a rail connection even more urgent. A bridge across the Missouri near Council Bluffs, solid enough to withstand floods and ice, would tie the established lines from Chicago and the Mississippi directly to the planned Pacific Road. Once that bridge existed, the town would be the natural funnel for freight and passengers from the east and the logical headquarters for construction moving west. Lincoln did not simply nod and agree. He pressed questions about cost, timelines, and political resistance. He wanted to know how many years the work might take and how far a company could reasonably build in a single construction season. Dodge responded with figures drawn from his own experience. He spoke of how many miles of grading a crew could finish in a month when properly supplied, how many carloads of rail and ties were needed for a given length, and how quickly everything slowed when materials failed to arrive. He described the chaos he had seen on poorly organized roads, where one crew graded far ahead, another laid scattered sections of track behind, and whole stretches lay idle because no one had planned the flow of supplies. That led him into ideas he had been shaping for some time but had not yet expressed in full. A project across the plains and mountains, he said, could not rely on the old habit of isolated crews and improvised camps. The builders would need a clear chain of authority in the field, with an engineer on the ground whose decisions could not be overruled from distant offices by men who had never seen the country. Work would have to be divided into fixed types of labor: grading, bridging, track laying, telegraph, each with its own specialists, and the supply trains would have to roll on a regular schedule, carrying rails, spikes, food, and tools in a set order. He did not yet use the later phrase about building a mile of track a day, but the logic was already present. The line could move only if every man knew his place and if materials reached the railhead without interruption. The talk on the porch went on long enough that the shadow of the hotel stretched across the street and reached the opposite boardwalk. Now and then someone stepped outside and hovered for a moment, recognizing Lincoln or Dodge, then withdrew again when it became clear no public remarks were coming. Pusey had long since left them to other business. The two men remained, one asking questions in a slow, deliberate drawl, the other answering in firm, economical sentences, both of them aware that the subject was larger than the bounds of the town around them. At one point, Lincoln shifted the line of inquiry away from engineering and cost. He asked what such a railroad would do to the country once finished. Dodge answered in the same practical tone. Freight that now took months by wagon could move in days. Troops could be rushed toward any trouble on the plains instead of marching along rivers for half a year before reaching the scene. Settlers could come with plows, seed, and household goods instead of abandoning half their belongings along the trail. A permanent line of iron, he said, would also force a kind of order even on the roughest stretches because stations and section houses would stand every few miles, each with telegraph instruments and men responsible for that piece of track. There was no talk of destiny or manifest plans. Dodge framed the matter as a series of obstacles to be handled. Hostile war parties would cut telegraph wires and tear up track if they could. The answer, in his view, was a chain of blockhouses and small garrisons at bridges and water stations, plus patrols and rapid repairs. Winter would freeze cuts and fill cuts with snow. The answer there was grading that respected drainage and careful placement of the line, to avoid drifts where possible. Drought would dry up small creeks. The response had to be an initial route that followed reliable rivers as far as the geography allowed. In each case, he took the same approach: identify the risk and design a way to work through it without stopping construction. As the sun began to drop toward the western horizon, lighting the Iowa bluffs and the far Nebraska bank with the same hard glow, Lincoln straightened from the rail and looked one more time toward the west. Then he said quietly that when the road was built, it would start right here, that many lines would meet at Council Bluffs, and that this place would be the one fixed point between the Atlantic states and whatever lay on the far side of the mountains. The words were not shouted, and there was no one close enough to cheer them even if they had been. They were dropped in the calm tone of a man who has reached a conclusion. Dodge did not respond with thanks or flattery. He merely nodded and said that if Congress ever made the road a reality, the choice of route and starting point would decide whether it worked or failed. Then the conversation ended. Lincoln had other men to see, letters to write, and preparation to make for the trip back downriver. Dodge had accounts waiting and crews in the field who expected instructions. They shook hands again, and Lincoln went back into the hotel while Dodge descended the porch steps to the street. The walk back to his office took him past the same stores and stables he had passed that morning, but his thoughts were somewhere else. He pictured in his mind the Platte Valley, the long stretch of land between the river's north and south forks, the distant line of the Rockies, and the countless small decisions that would be required to drive a railroad that far. He knew that for now those decisions belonged to no one. Congress had failed more than once to settle on a charter. Moneyed men backed different routes according to where they owned land. The war that many expected was beginning to push itself into every conversation. Yet he also knew that when the time came, the man who had just listened to him on that porch might be in a position to make the route he had described into an official line rather than a suggestion. In the weeks that followed, Dodge returned to his regular rounds. He rode out to check bridge sites on smaller Iowa lines, carrying his transit strapped to the back of a wagon or held across his own saddle. He camped in crude shelters on prairie rises, listening to the wind push through grass that moved in long sheets. He kept weather notes in his field books, marking where spring rains turned dry gullies into torrents and where summer heat baked the soil hard enough to crack. Those observations went into designs for culverts, embankments, and ditches, but they also deepened his conviction about the Platte route. Each new stretch of country he studied seemed either worse or no better than the long valley he had already chosen. Evenings in Council Bluffs, he sat at the office table copying field notes, running rough calculations, and drafting correspondence for banks and contractors. Talk in town about Pacific. Railroads came and went. Some men treated the idea as nothing more than a subject for speeches and newspaper editorials. Others tried to guess which town on the Missouri would benefit most if the road ever started. Dodge said little in those conversations. He already had his answer, and repeating it would not build a mile of track in the meantime. Instead, he stored up what he knew and kept refining the habits that would later matter more than any sentence uttered in a hotel parlor. By the time autumn wind began to strip leaves from the few trees around town, the meeting of August had settled into his memory as something important but unfinished. There had been no promise, only a clear exchange between a man who understood law and politics and a man who knew the land. In years to come, Dodge would have to fight railroad speculators, winter storms, hostile raids, and shortages of every kind. On that day, none of those battles had yet begun. There was only a river town, a rough porch, and the beginning of a plan to push iron from that muddy edge of Iowa toward the far line of the mountains. April 18, 1863. Rain has soaked the red clay of North Alabama through the night, and the morning opens under a low sky that presses down on the camps along the railroad. The track ahead is a broken line. Rails lie twisted beside the embankment. Ties are charred and split. A small trestle over a narrow creek has collapsed into blackened timbers, and telegraph poles lean or have been chopped and left scattered in the wet grass. Grenville M. Dodge rides forward along the torn right-of-way with a small staff group, mud spattering the legs of his horse and the lower panels of his stained uniform coat. He carries the rank of brigadier general and the responsibility for the railroad that feeds a federal army pushing through Tennessee and into this corner of Alabama. The line behind him runs back toward Nashville and the depots that hold food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement rail. The line in front of him must be made usable again if that army is to keep moving. He reins in near the wrecked trestle and dismounts without a word. The air carries the smell of wet ash, pine sap, and the sour stink of burned creosote from the destroyed bridge timbers. A pair of engineers stand waiting on the bank of the creek, boots sunk in the mud. They have measured the gap and sketched a rough plan on a stained sheet of paper held flat against a fence rail. Dodge takes the pencil, studies the dimensions, and looks from the numbers to the wreckage. The enemy raiders who did this work have chosen a weak point, a span where the line crosses a narrow channel between low banks. They have piled brush against the supports, soaked it in whatever fuel they could seize, and fired the whole structure. They have pulled a section of rail, heated it in the flames, and bent it until it curled. The damage is thorough but not complicated. There are no high stone piers to rebuild, no deep water. It is exactly the sort of problem Dodge has trained himself to solve quickly and in a repeatable way. He calls for the foreman of the construction details. Infantry soldiers already waiting along the grade shift their weight, tools resting on their shoulders. Many are from regiments that once marched with him in the early years of the war. Others are new, pulled from units assigned to guard duty along this vulnerable stretch. Mixed among them are laborers who until recently worked under slave drivers on nearby plantations. Now they wear mismatched clothing and carry Army-issued tools, part of the workforce Dodge has drawn into his system because he refuses to let manpower sit unused when iron and ties lie idle. He lays out the work in a flat, even voice. One group will clear the wreckage from the creek, cutting away burned timbers and dragging out debris until water flows clean beneath the grade line. Another will begin cutting fresh piles and caps from nearby timber using standard lengths and diameters that Dodge has set so the carpenters can work without fresh calculations at every crossing. A third gang will handle the rails and ties, stripping away the damaged wood, laying new ties at a fixed spacing and spiking down fresh iron as soon as the bridge frame stands. Nothing is improvised beyond the first quick look at the damage. Dodge has already turned these types of repairs into drills. Each man knows that his group will repeat the same motions when the next trestle goes down or the next culvert is blown. Dodge walks along the line of men assigning tasks with a few short sentences, then moves back to the edge of the creek and studies the ground again. His staff officers take down his decisions and pass them to the company officers in charge of the working parties. Farther back along the line, a repair train waits under guard. Boxcars hold rails stacked in precise tiers, bundles of spikes, kegs of bolts, and heavy chairs. Flat cars carry tie loads and timber. A small tool car carries jacks, wrenches, sledges, and climbing gear for bridge work. Dodge has insisted that every such train be arranged the same way. When it arrives at a break, the crews know which car to open first and which loads to pull in what order. That pattern saves minutes at each stop, and in this campaign, minutes decide whether an army advances or sits hungry. A telegraph crew works parallel to the track gang. They have brought coils of wire, insulators, and fresh poles. Some of the poles still stand, but their lines hang cut and slack. Others have been felled entirely. Dodge orders them to rebuild the line with the same spacing used elsewhere, then add protective details at stations and key bridges. The wire serves as his nervous system. Through it, he expects reports of any break or attack to reach him in minutes rather than hours, and his habit is to reply within the same hour with specific instructions. The region around the line is not quiet. Small Confederate cavalry bands and irregulars know the ground. They slip out of pine thickets to fire on pickets, cut telegraph wire, and tear loose rails. Some plant charges under bridges and culverts. They know that if they can keep the railroad out of service, they can slow or even halt federal pressure in this sector. Dodge views them not as an abstract threat, but as a constant cost. Every mile of exposed track has to be hardened in a way that forces raiders to risk their lives for any small damage they inflict. He has already started solving that problem with blockhouses. At the larger bridges and important water tanks, his engineers build compact wooden forts with thick walls made from squared logs. Each has loopholes for rifles, a small platform for a light cannon where possible, and a stockpile of ammunition and supplies that can sustain a garrison through a siege. Infantry detachments occupy these posts. Their orders are simple and severe. They are to hold the structure, guard the bridge or culvert beside it, and send immediate telegraph warnings if they see anything. On this day in April, Dodge decides that the trestle now lying in the creek will receive such a blockhouse once rebuilt. He marks its position on his field map and dictates quick instructions. The pattern will match the others he has already set along the line. A standard plan makes it easier to train garrisons and to estimate the lumber required. It also allows him to judge at a glance on later inspections whether each fort has been completed as ordered. The rain eases into a mist. Axes begin to sound in the nearby woods where men cut timber for the new span. Saw crews work in teams, hands moving in a steady rhythm through wet fiber. Down in the creek, soldiers wade in cold water up to their thighs, levering blackened beams free and dragging them clear with ropes. The wrecked iron is gathered in a pile to be reworked or discarded. Men curse under their breath when they slip in the mud, but the complaints never reach Dodge. He has set a tone that does not encourage talk about how hard the work is. He focuses on output and expects others to adjust their attitudes to match. An orderly brings him a folded dispatch. It has come along the remaining working segment of telegraph line that his crews keep open. The message is from higher command, stressing again that the railroad must be kept operating to support offensives farther east. Dodge reads it, nods once, and returns it without comment. The urgency in the words does not change his schedule. He has already organized his command to treat every break as an emergency, and he does not waste time re-emphasizing that point when the day's plan is already in motion. He rides back along the line to inspect earlier repair sites. At one creek, a new trestle stands with braces still fresh and pale. A blockhouse sits at one end, its walls already darkened by rain. Inside, a small garrison drills at the sound of a signal. The officer in charge meets Dodge at the door and reports on ammunition stores, ration levels, and the condition of the telegraph instruments bolted to a shelf in the interior. Dodge listens, checks the telegraph key himself, and taps out a brief test message to a station downline. The reply comes back in clean clicks. Satisfied, he moves on. He keeps a mental ledger of each element of his system. Rail stock in the depots, ties stacked at sawmills, fatigue levels in the labor gangs, the number of blockhouses finished and garrisoned, the number still framed but uncovered. He knows roughly how many miles of line each gang can grade, how many feet of bridge each carpentry team can erect in a day, and how many men are needed to keep the telegraph wire in working order across a given distance of country. These figures are not abstract. They guide every order he issues. As he travels, he reviews decisions already made. Early in his tenure here, some officers urged that troops be concentrated in larger camps far from the track, with patrols sent out when cuts or bridges were threatened. Dodge rejected that idea. To his mind, scattered blockhouses and small permanent detachments at every key point make more sense. A raiding party might surprise one post and inflict casualties, but they will find it harder to damage several guarded structures in a single night. Even if they succeed at one location, the telegraph will carry that news along the line and nearby troops can move quickly to close the gap. Toward midday, word reaches him of a skirmish near a small siding a few miles ahead. A patrol had spotted riders near a pile of stored ties and exchanged fire. The raiders fled without managing to set anything alight. Dodge turns his horse and heads for the site. When he arrives, the air still smells of burned powder. A few men stand near shallow, fresh-dug graves. A wounded soldier sits on a crate, bandage wrapped around his upper arm, face gray with pain. Dodge questions the officers on the scene. He wants lengths of engagement, numbers, direction of enemy withdrawal, and whether the patrol followed doctrine. He has issued clear rules. Men detailed to protect the railroad are not to chase raiders deep into the countryside, risking ambush and leaving the line itself uncovered. Their job is to hold the ground around the track and to break up attacks quickly. In this case, they have followed his instructions. The enemy has been driven off, the material remains intact, and the wounded have been evacuated toward medical care. He orders that an additional small earthwork be started at the siding and that a short spur be improved to allow quicker loading of repair materials. Every small improvement like this fits into his larger pattern. His aim is to turn the railroad into a defended artery that can sustain not just trains, but also the work of constant rebuilding. In practice, this means that even during active raids and sporadic firefights, wood can be cut, rails unloaded, and bridges framed without long halts. When afternoon settles, Dodge returns to the morning's wreck site. Progress is visible in every direction. The creek has been cleared. New piles stand driven into the bed cut to uniform height. Caps and stringers stretch across them, bolted together. On the bank, carpenters cut decking timbers to length. A line of men passes fresh ties forward, dropping them in place once the deck is nailed. The iron gang waits with bars and spiking hammers, ready to swing into motion as soon as the first bays are laid. Dodge watches the sequence without interfering. He has already made his decisions. Now he observes how well the teams carry them out. Their movements show the result of repetition. Each man knows the order of tasks. There is little wandering, few questions. When a problem appears, such as a warped pile that does not seat properly, the foreman brings it to Dodge quickly. Dodge chooses a fix in a sentence or two and moves on. The replacement pile is cut, driven, and the delay closes fast. He measures the time required from arrival to near completion. The figures line up with his expectations. That confirmation matters to him. He intends to use these numbers to plan later work. If a certain bridge type takes a fixed number of hours with a known crew size, he can forecast how long an entire division of track with similar structures will require, even before the first blow of an axe. In his mind, war has not changed his underlying job. He still turns ground and materials into a functioning road, only now the road has armed enemies attacking it while it grows. Later in the day, he meets with the officers in charge of the railroad guards for this sector. They gather in a small frame building that serves as a temporary headquarters. The room smells of wet wool, tobacco, and ink. A rough map of the line hangs on the wall, with penciled notes beside each bridge, water stop, and junction. Dodge stands beside that map and points to each location in turn. He asks for a status report. For every stretch of track, he wants to know whether repairs are complete, what garrison strength is present, whether the telegraph is functioning, and whether local civilians have been cooperative or hostile. He does not waste time on long speeches. When he hears of a weak point, he issues immediate corrective orders. A blockhouse that still lacks a full roof must be finished within a set number of days. A section where telegraph messages come through with irregular delays must see its line walked and its joints tightened. A garrison that has reported discipline problems must receive a visit from a senior officer, and if necessary, an exchange of personnel with a harder unit. Dodge views each item on the map as a component in a larger machine and adjusts it accordingly. As evening approaches, the first train creeps across the newly rebuilt trestle under a slow bell. Dodge rides alongside the track as the locomotive eases over the fresh timbers. Steam blows in white bursts against the cooling air. Men stand clear but close enough to watch every flex in the decking and braces. The structure holds. Wheels roll across the span, rails sing under the weight, and the train gathers speed once the engineer sees that nothing shifts. The telegraph wire above the line already carries a simple message to the next station that the crossing is open. Behind this train, others will follow, loaded with supplies for the troops advancing beyond. Later that night, a detail will begin work on the blockhouse that will stand near the trestle, turning the repaired point into a defended one. In this way, each day's labor adds not just to the length of usable track, but also to its resilience. Dodge ends the day in a small office beside the line, lantern light throwing hard shadows across the maps on his table. He goes over reports that have come in from other segments. Some list minor breaks repaired by local gangs before word even reached him. Others describe planned improvements to sidings and depots. The pattern is the one he has sought to create. Problems are spotted quickly, addressed according to standard methods, and reported as completed within short time frames. He writes a brief summary for his superiors, noting miles of track inspected, number of breaks repaired, and new defensive work started or finished. He does not dramatize the effort. Instead, he documents it in clear figures. To outside readers, these reports may appear dry. To Dodge, they capture the essential fact that the railroad within his charge has remained in operation despite active opposition, rough weather, and the strain of continuous use. Outside, the night air carries the distant sound of another train moving along the line, its exhaust spaced in regular bursts, its wheels clattering over joints. To Dodge, that sound is proof that his methods work under pressure. The experience he gains along this war-torn railroad, managing armed guards, disciplined work gangs, telegraph dispatching, and standardized repair practices, settles into him as a permanent set of habits. In years to come, when he directs construction far from any battlefield, he will call on the same system of relentless organization, fixed patterns of work, and unbroken daily progress that he refines here in North Alabama under the demands of war. May 1, 1866. Cold air from the Missouri River pushes through the unfinished windows of the Union Pacific offices on the Nebraska bank, carrying the smell of mud, coal smoke, and raw lumber. A few locomotives wheeze in the yards below, their wheels streaked with rust from too much standing still. West of Omaha, only a short run of iron reaches across the prairie, a thin line ending in grated dirt and scattered ties. For the money already spent, it is a poor return. Grenville M. Dodge stands over a table in a bare upstairs room, uniform coat traded for civilian clothes, but posture still rigid from years of command. On the boards before him lie route maps, cost sheets, survey notes, and an open letter from Thomas C. Durant. Durant has pressed him for months to take charge in the field. The railroad has poured out hundreds of thousands of dollars and laid only a few dozen miles of track. Dodge has finally answered, agreeing to come on one condition, that in the field his word will not be overridden. He understands Durant's talent for money and manipulation from their Iowa railroad days. That is why the acceptance letter he sent from military service stated bluntly that he would work for the Union Pacific only if field authority remained in his hands. The paper on the table confirms it. In May, he has resigned from the Army with the backing of Ulysses Grant and William Sherman, then moved his base to Omaha as chief engineer. The responsibility in front of him is simple to describe and brutal to execute. He must push a railroad from this muddy river town to the Great Basin and beyond, with no existing infrastructure behind him but fragile river traffic and scattered eastern railroads. He starts by looking at the facts on the ground. Before him is the record of construction to date. Ground was broken on the Nebraska side of the river years earlier. Since then, progress has crawled. Rails reach only a short distance out of Omaha. Each winter, the Missouri is locked up with ice. In the best months, steamers have picked their way upriver from St. Joseph, carrying rail, chairs, spikes, bridge timbers, locomotives, and cars. The navigation season has been short and uncertain, blocked by sandbars and snags. Between river closures and poor organization, the builders have squandered time. Dodge walks the yards to see it with his own eyes. On the level land below the bluffs, great stacks of iron rest near the tracks. Rails from Pennsylvania mills lie in ordered piles. Near them are crates of fish plates and drums of spikes. On another stretch stand ties, some of hardwood, many of cottonwood, cut along the river bottoms. Not far away, a long steel cylinder marks the burnetizing plant, where cottonwood ties are pressure-treated with zinc chloride to slow decay. Men there load rough ties into the chamber, vent air, and pump in solution twice each day. The work is noisy, hot, and not as effective as hoped. Treated cottonwood still tends to split and hold spikes poorly, but there is no better timber close by. He moves through the machine shops where frames for cars and locomotives stand half-assembled, and through sheds where blacksmiths shape tools and bridge fittings. The place runs, but without tight rhythm. Materials sit longer than they should. Carloads are not arranged with the job sequence in mind. When Dodge asks foreman how many cars it takes to supply a mile of track with everything needed, the answers are vague and differ from one man to another. That unsettles him more than the sight of rust. Back upstairs, he closes the door and begins the reorganization. First, he defines the line of authority. In the field, there will be no split command. His office will determine the route, set standards of grade and curvature, and approve every major variation. Under him, Samuel B. Reed will act as chief of construction, responsible for keeping materials and crews moving at all points west of the river. Existing contractors will be held to clear production expectations. Herbert "Hub" Hoxie will still hold the original contract on paper, but Dodge intends that in practice the flow of work will follow his own plan, not the whims of speculators in the East. Next, he standardizes the road itself. For the eastern section, the company has used lighter iron supported by chairs, a mounting system already showing weaknesses. Dodge orders that for the remaining distance, heavier wrought iron rails will be joined with fish plates, with 2 ties under every joint. Tie spacing is fixed, so crews no longer guess where to drop them. He dictates a regular pattern for mixing hardwood and cottonwood ties, placing stronger wood at rail joints and in the center of each length where the load is highest. Bridge types are specified in standard forms. Small watercourses will receive timber trestles built to one of a few repeated designs, to be replaced with stone or more permanent structures later when time allows. He then tackles supply mathematics. Sitting at the table with a pencil and a stack of earlier field reports, Dodge works out what it actually costs in material to build 1 mile of line out on the open plains. Rails, ties, fastenings, timber for small trestles, culvert stone where available, fuel for locomotives, food for men, feed for animals, tents, tools, and spare parts all must move forward from the Missouri River. When he totals the weights and volumes, the figure is stark. To supply 1 mile of track demands roughly 40 carloads. Every additional 100 miles between Omaha and the railhead multiplies the burden. Instead of being discouraged, he takes the number as a design constraint. If 40 cars furnish a mile, then trains must be made up in that pattern as often as possible. In his instructions to Reed and the operating department, he specifies that construction trains will leave Omaha yards loaded in consistent order, car by car, with rails, ties, fastenings, bridge timber, provisions, and camp equipment arranged, so that unloading follows the order of work along the grade. He does not limit his planning to figures and drawings. That winter and early spring in Omaha, another man has been preparing for the same fight from a different angle. John Jack Casement, a tough former Union officer, has contracted to handle track laying. His brother Daniel handles finance and contracts. During the cold months, Jack Casement has worked in the shops on a string of boxcars mounted on Union Pacific underframes. Inside, carpenters have built bunks in tiers, fitted stoves, and partitioned off sections as kitchen, dining space, office, pantry, and storehouse. One car carries a small armory with stacked rifles and ammunition ready for hostile country. Dodge visits these cars while they are still standing in the Omaha yards. He steps through narrow doors into cramped interiors where iron bunks line both sides, straw mattresses piled on top of one another, and nailed racks waiting for gear. The air smells of new wood, paint, and cold iron. Casement explains that these will be the homes of his crews. As the railroad advances, the cars will be hooked into a construction train that follows the front. Instead of keeping men in fixed camps far behind the railhead, the whole camp will roll with the work. The idea fits Dodge's own thinking. A mobile base solves several problems at once. It reduces wasted time marching from distant tents to the day's work. It keeps commissary and medical supplies close at hand. It lets firearms travel with the men through country where attacks may come at any time. Most of all, it ties the working crews directly to the railroad they are building, making it easier to enforce discipline and to shift gangs quickly when pressure points appear. He and the Casement brothers agree on the division of labor. Survey parties will move furthest ahead, marking the line with stakes through the Platte Valley and up toward the Laramie Plains. Behind them, grading crews will use scrapers, carts, and hand tools to shape the earth into the designed profile, throwing up embankments where needed and cutting away rises. At stream crossings, bridge gangs will move in with pre-cut timbers, following standard drawings so they can assemble trestles quickly. Only when that work is complete will Casement's track layers enter. The track gang itself is broken down into specialized squads. Dodge has seen during the war that men who repeat the same task daily gain speed and reliability impossible in mixed crews. On the Union Pacific, he and Casement formalize this. A light flat car drawn by a horse with a long rope will carry rails forward to the very end of the laid line. 2 men will grab the end of a rail, others spaced along its length will lift in pairs, and together they will trot forward, drop the rail to align with the previous section, then hurry back for the next. Behind them, gaugers will check the distance between the rails with bars, adjusting until it is exact. Spikers will follow, sledgehammers rising and falling, 10 spikes to each length. Bolters will fasten fish plates at each joint. Dodge watches an early trial run west of Omaha. The horse trots up with its car, rope taut. Rails come off in a practiced rhythm. Men move with short, efficient steps. Spikes ring as sledges strike in 3 quick blows per spike. Further back, another gang spreads ballast, then tampers pack earth under and around the ties to hold them firm. On a rise beyond, telegraph workers climb new poles, stringing the wire that will carry orders and reports between Omaha and the advancing front. He notes time for each operation, how many rails are placed per minute, how many spikes driven, how far ballast squads fall behind if the pace increases. The pattern is close to what he wants, but not yet perfect. He orders small changes. Supply cars must be loaded so that rails for the next several minutes sit nearest the door. Tool racks must hold spare sledges and bars in fixed places so replacements can be grabbed without search when a handle breaks or a head flies off. Cook cars must serve meals at set hours that fit the work schedule so no crew stretches a break or lingers in line. Life inside the rolling camp is harsh. When the construction train pulls out, men crowd into their assigned cars. Bunks are narrow. The air turns thick with smoke and sweat when stoves burn in cold weather. Complaints rise about vermin and noise. Casement deals with chronic troublemakers in his own direct fashion, fists and boots where needed. And Dodge does not interfere as long as fights do not slow work. Both men know that along this temporary moving town of 20 cars, murders and beatings will occur. Where local authorities exist, they are often powerless or corrupt. Discipline rests mainly in the hands of the contractor and his lieutenants. Beyond Omaha, the land opens. The Platte Valley lies broad and mostly flat, just as Dodge remembered from earlier surveys. Once the first few dozen miles of heavier rail leave the river behind, the organization he has designed begins to show results. With grading and bridging ahead and the construction train tight behind, the track mileage starts to climb. By that first summer under Dodge as chief engineer, the crews will add dozens of miles and push the line toward the 100-mile point that the law has set as a secure claim on the route westward. Omaha itself feels the strain and the promise. The streets fill with teamsters hauling supplies to temporary storage points. Saloons take the pay of men who have come off exhausting shifts on the grade. The burnettizing works run long days, turning out treated ties that still crack under hammer blows but last longer than green wood. Steamers nose up to the river, landing loaded with more iron, machinery, and food. When the river freezes, the company will throw a temporary pile bridge across the channel to keep traffic moving from the Iowa side, a link Dodge welcomes because it steadies his supply line. He keeps the headquarters staff on the same tight schedule as the field crews. Clerks in Omaha learn to assemble car manifests according to his 40-car-per-mile rule. Telegraph operators are trained to relay daily reports of miles graded, bridges erected, and track laid. Reed sends in summaries from forward camps detailing any shortage, delay, or enemy activity. Dodge reads each one, compares them with his own estimates, and sends back short directives. If a gang underperforms, he demands reasons and corrects them with reassignment or extra resources. If a particular section of country threatens to slow the pace, he orders more wagons, more animals, or an advanced stockpile of rails and ties. In the middle of 1866, the effect of his methods becomes visible beyond the accounting books. Visitors from the east arrive on a special excursion in the fall, running out along the new track to see what their money and legislation have produced. They find it difficult to catch the working crews. Reports describe the track gang laying close to 2 miles of rail in a single day out on the prairie, the construction train camp drawing away from the viewers even as they try to reach it. The sight of men running forward with rails, sledges ringing in rapid succession, and cars tipping aside to let the next load pass stays with the observers long after they return home. By the time the season turns cold again, Dodge has done what he set out to do that day in May when he first stood at the Omaha office window. He has converted a stalled undertaking into a moving system. The Union Pacific no longer depends on scattered efforts and improvised camps. Instead, an organized chain stretches from the yards beside the Missouri through the shops and storage piles onto the construction trains and out to the railhead. Each part has defined tasks, timetables, and standards. Every mile the line advances will demand the same 40 carloads of material and the same hard labor. But under his direction, those carloads and that labor now move in a pattern that can reach for a mile of finished railroad in a day once the crews reach full speed. The tactic is not a single trick or dramatic gesture. It is the steady application of discipline, calculation, and relentless daily work that Dodge has shaped from his wartime experience and brought to bear on the open plains. October 5, 1866. At dawn, the prairie near the 100th meridian lies under a thin frost. Grass blades are stiff and pale, crunching under boots. Cook fires throw low smoke that drifts flat in the cold air. The new track glints faintly in the slanted light, a narrow line of iron running west until it vanishes against the horizon. Beyond the last jointed bar, rough grade waits, pale earth piled in a long, even ridge. Ties lie in stacks, rails rest on low skids, and men move slowly at first, shoulders hunched against the chill, gathering around the tool racks and the horse car that will carry the day's iron forward. Grenville M. Dodge is already on his feet, wrapped in a heavy coat against the bite of the morning. He has slept only a few hours in a cramped car of the construction train. A table wedged into one corner holds maps, progress charts, and telegraph copies. On that table lies the figure that has fixed itself in his mind for months, the longitude that marks the 100th meridian, which federal law has chosen as a test of whether this railroad deserves to keep its charter and grant lands. The charter allowed until the end of 1868 to reach this line. It is now the autumn of 1866, and the railhead stands close enough that surveyors can see the target on their instruments. Dodge steps down to the frozen ground and walks toward the front of the construction camp. The air smells of coffee, bacon grease, wood smoke, and cold iron. Somewhere a hammer strikes a spike left loose the night before, a flat ring that carries along the line. Horses stamp and snort near the rail car loaded for the first run. The track gang gathers in loose formation, men muffled in coats, caps pulled low, tools slung over shoulders. They have been out here for months, pushing the line west, and their bodies show it, faces burned by sun and wind, hands thickened by constant work. He does not call them together for a speech. He has no taste for oratory at the railhead. Instead, he moves through the groups, checking the details that matter, the condition of tools, the arrangement of rails on the horse car, the stacks of ties along the grade. He asks the foreman about yesterday's totals. They report miles laid, joints bolted, and ballast spread. The numbers match the figures he holds in his head. For days, they have been putting down nearly a mile of track in each stretch of open ground, the rhythm he has worked toward since he first set up the rolling camp system. A short distance ahead, the survey party stands with instruments already leveled. The 100th meridian itself is invisible, an abstract line drawn on government charts, but on this day it has been reduced to a spot that can be seen through the telescope of a transit. The chief surveyor gives Dodge a nod as he looks back from the tripod. They have checked the reading twice. The point lies only a few rail lengths beyond where the last tie now rests. Dodge had driven the pace hard to make this moment arrive early. He knows the text of the law that chartered the Union Pacific. Reaching this longitude by the legal deadline would have been enough to protect the company from losing its rights. Doing so 2 years ahead of that limit does more. It announces that under his methods, this railroad is not dragging itself across the plains. It is moving with energy that investors and politicians can see and count. He thinks back only long enough to mark the difference between the stalled effort he found at Omaha in the spring and the activity around him now. Then he lets the comparison go. The past does not interest him when there is work in front of the railhead. He fixes his attention on the day's sequence. The grading crews ahead have already shaped the roadbed for some distance beyond the meridian point. Bridge gangs have finished small timber structures over the shallow draws and intermittent creeks of this country. Supply trains have brought iron, spikes, bolts, and timber as far forward as the rails allow. The construction train stands just behind, its cars packed in the standard order that he and the Casement brothers had set months earlier. The whistle from the locomotive at the rear gives a sharp call. Men in the track gang begin to shrug off their coats. The horse is led into position, ropes looped to the low car that holds rails stacked side by side. At a shouted order, the animal leans into the harness and pulls. Wheels clatter as the car rolls slowly along the finished track toward the railhead. 2 men climb onto the load, ready to push each bar toward the end as needed. When the car stops at the last laid joint, the sequence begins. 2 lifters grab the near end of a rail, others station themselves along its length, and at the word, they lift together. Boots crunch on the stiff ground as they trot forward in a practiced shuffle, carrying the heavy iron to the first set of ties on the bare grade. They drop it in place with short grunts, lining its end against the last joint. Gaugers step in, bars in hand, checking the space between the new rail and its mate. They nudge it right or left until the measure matches the fixed standard. Spikers follow, hammers rising and falling in sharp strokes, driving each spike with a tight set of well-aimed blows. Behind them, bolters crouch at the joints, fitting fish plates on either side, sliding bolts through the holes and tightening nuts with wrenches. Further back, the ballast crew spreads earth and broken stone, filling around the ties and tamping it firm with hand tools. They lower their shoulders into the work, backs bent, muscles straining. Every man knows the routine. They have repeated these motions day after day over miles of similar ground. Dodge watches the line of activity move forward, rail by rail, joint by joint. He checks his watch. The pace matches his expectations. He carries in his mind the exact length of rail in each section, the number needed for a given distance, and the time allowed for each placement if the crew is to reach the goal before sunset. On firm, open prairie like this, his requirement is simple. The line must grow by at least a mile. He does not allow the men to treat that number as an aspiration. It is a quota. If they have not reached it by mid-afternoon, foreman can expect him to appear in person with questions that are not polite. As the work continues, a special train waits a short distance back from the railhead. It carries company officers, members of Congress, and other guests who have come to see the meridian reached. Men in better clothes than the workers stand on the car platforms, eyes narrowed against the wind, watching the gangs. Some talk among themselves about land values and freight predictions. Others stare in silence at the bare country stretching away to the south and north, an expanse that holds few trees and only scattered signs of settlement. To most of them, this landscape is new and harsh. To Dodge, it is familiar, a ground he once crossed with survey stakes and now crosses with iron. He does not bother to climb aboard the excursion cars until the essential work is finished. When word comes from the surveyor that the next rail will cross the calculated line, Dodge walks to the front and takes a place near the transit. The surveyor points to a faint mark on a tall stake driven beside the grade. That stake will later hold a signboard, but for now it is only a guide for the track gang. They bring the next rail forward with a little more care, aware that the company's officers are watching. The gaugers check the distance one extra time. Spikers drive with sharp, precise strokes. When the last spike for that length is set, the gang steps back. The surveyor peers again through his instrument, confirms the position, and nods. The 100th meridian has been reached. A cheer rises from the workers and visitors alike, a low, rough sound from the track gang joined by higher voices from the cars behind. Hats lift into the air. For a moment, the line at the railhead is not just another stretch of iron on grade, but a mark of obligation met. Dodge's reaction is controlled. He allows himself a brief handshake with the senior surveyor and a few words of acknowledgement with the company men, then turns back toward the construction train. In his view, this point is important because it proves that his system can outrun the timetable set by law. The fact that they are 2 years ahead on this measure means that if they can keep the organization tight, the railroad has a real chance to break through the plains and reach the foothills on a schedule that will secure more than just formal compliance. It will secure dominance over any competing line behind them. A photographer has come out with the excursion party, his equipment hauled in a dedicated car. He sets up his camera near the stake, positioning a group of men around it. Dodge is pulled into the arrangement with company officers, surveyors, and track workers. They stand in a rough semicircle, faces still, hands at their sides or resting on tools. The wind tugs at coats and hats while the photographer removes the lens cap and counts the seconds in his head. The exposed plate will carry an image of this moment back east as proof that the railroad has beaten its legal deadline. When the picture is taken, Dodge steps out of the cluster and checks his watch again. Minutes have passed with no rails laid. That is enough leisure to his mind. He gives a short command to the track foreman. The horse car moves forward once more and the rhythm resumes. Visitors drift back to their own train. Some stay at the windows watching as the railhead pulls away, leaving them behind. Dodge notices but does not adjust his schedule to accommodate them. His job is to keep the line moving. Excursion parties are secondary. Throughout the day, the crews push on. The sun climbs high and strips the last of the frost from the grass. Dust begins to rise under boots and hooves. The iron bars grow warm to the touch. Sweat shows dark on shirts and jackets. Men drink from canteens between lifts and hammer strokes. The noise never drops for long. The clank of metal, the thud of tampers, the murmur of short commands. Wagons bring up more ties from stacks farther back. The construction train inches ahead as the railhead shifts, always staying close enough that the movement of supplies requires as little time as possible. Dodge keeps an eye on the telegraph as well as the track. A portable office stands near the head of the construction train, wire running back along poles that recede toward the last station. Operators inside tap messages to Omaha, reporting the meridian reached and miles laid. Replies bring congratulations and fresh questions about future targets. To the east, the news will trigger cheers in offices and boardrooms. To Dodge, the telegraph's main value is more practical. It lets him order more material forward, adjust train schedules, and keep the steady stream of resources aligned with the front. In the afternoon, a problem appears when a car supposed to carry spikes arrives partly empty because of an earlier miscount at Omaha. The supply at the railhead drops faster than expected. Foremen report that if they continue at the current rate, they will be short before dark. Dodge does not accept the idea of stopping the day's work early. He orders the remaining spikes concentrated at the front and has men walk back along the line to pull any excess from temporary sidings or unused piles. He sends a telegraph back down the wire instructing the nearest station to divert a carload of fastenings from a secondary project and push it ahead as a special. He then adjusts the tasks for some of the gangs. Instead of standing idle while spikes are gathered, they move to widen ditches, clear drainage, and reinforce embankment edges along recently laid stretches. That way, when fresh fastenings arrive, the remaining rails can go down without interruption while the supporting earthworks are already improved. The shift is not dramatic, but it reflects his habit of never letting available labor go unused. Every man present must either move the line forward, strengthen what has been built, or resupply those who do. Toward evening, the special car of spikes arrives, hauled as fast as the locomotive can safely travel over the just-finished track. Men cheer when they see it approach. Barrels are rolled off, lids pried open, and canvas bags filled. The spikers return to full pace, hammers rising and falling in a steady pattern as the light begins to fade. By the time the sun drops low, the gang has not only crossed the meridian but carried the rails beyond it by a solid margin. The day's tally meets Dodge's standard. As darkness gathers, the construction train pulls up to its new resting place. Cook fires are lit again. The wind shifts, bringing a colder edge. Men fall on their food with the hunger of bodies pushed hard for hours. Some drift toward the temporary grog shops and gambling tents that have set up near the work. These rough fringe settlements spring up wherever the end of track stands for more than a few days. Their presence brings fights, theft, and occasional killings. Dodge tolerates them only because he does not have the force or legal backing to clear them away entirely. What he can control is the way his own workers behave on duty. Off duty, he relies on the Casement brothers and their tough enforcers to keep the worst of the disorder out of the camp cars. Later that night, Dodge sits at his small table in the office car, lantern light falling on the day's notes. He writes down the exact location of the new railhead, the number of miles built, and the moment the line crossed the meridian line that Congress had named. He adds remarks on the spike shortage and the way the gap was handled. He notes the performance of specific gangs, praising some in brief phrases and marking others for closer attention if their output continues to lag. He does not dwell on the presence of dignitaries or the photographer's plate. In his record, the important facts are the distance gained, the status of materials, and the demonstration that his system can deliver more than the law requires in less time than promised. The early arrival at the 100th meridian proves that his combination of standardized grading, rolling camp organization, tight scheduling, and constant supervision has turned a patchwork effort into a machine that can move across the plains at a measured rate. Outside, the wind whistles gently along the line of cars. Telegraph wire hums faintly on its poles. The newly laid rails cool in the dark, their joints faintly ticking as metal contracts. Somewhere down the track, a picket calls to another in the night, voices carrying over flat land. Dodge hears the sounds through the thin walls and files them away without comment. Tomorrow the horse will pull the car of rails forward again. The gangs will take up their tools and the line will stretch further into the interior. The 100th meridian is behind them now. Not a finish line, but a mark on the ground that confirms his belief that with enough control and will, this railroad can be driven ahead day after day until it reaches the mountains. July 5, 1867. The high plains around Crow Creek lie under a hard blue sky that offers no shade. The air is thin and dry at this elevation, and the ground is a faded mat of short grass broken by dust patches and low sage. Crow Creek itself cuts a narrow line through the land, water running shallow and brown between banks that crumble when stepped on. To the west, the dark outline of the Laramie Mountains shows against the distance, a low wall that will not be gentle to a railroad. Grenville M. Dodge stands near the creek with his survey party, boots powdered with dust, eyes narrowed against the glare. Behind him, a few tents and wagons mark the temporary camp. A handful of soldiers from the Department of the Platte lounge near their stacked muskets, looking over the open country with the same cautious habit they learned on other frontiers. Dodge pays them little attention at first. His focus is on the ground that will hold a town and the tracks that must run through it. The day before, Independence Day had brought speeches, toasts, and a band. Officers and railroad men gathered on this same ground under fluttering flags. Dodge had stood up in front of them and announced that here, at Crow Creek Crossing in Dakota Territory, the Union Pacific would fix its mountain headquarters. At that same celebration, Major General Christopher C. Auger had announced that the Army would build a fort several miles to the west to guard the railroad and its men. The talk had been loud and confident. Now, with the crowds returned to their own camps and the noise gone, Dodge has to turn the announcement into survey stakes and lines on paper. He starts at the creek. The planned main line will cross Crow Creek at a point where the banks are firm enough to carry a timber bridge without constant repair. He walks the channel with his transit man, checking the approaches on both sides. There must be room for an embankment, trestle bents, and a solid roadbed that will not wash out when spring runoff swells the stream. They choose a spot where the banks rise a little higher and the ground feels compact under their boots. Dodge notes the position in his field book, adding grade figures for the approach ramps. From that fixed point he works outward. The main track will run roughly east and west, tied to the surveyed line that climbs from the Platte Valley toward the Laramie Mountains. On each side of the main line he wants room for sidings, a depot, a freight platform, a roundhouse site, and shop buildings. Behind those railroad structures he intends to leave space for the town that speculators and settlers will raise as soon as word spreads. He is not in the business of designing comfortable neighborhoods, but he knows that merchants, boarding house keepers, saloon keepers, and freight agents will arrive fast if the railroad marks this as a division point. He calls to his chief of party and dictates the basic layout. Streets will run parallel and perpendicular to the tracks, simple and regular. Cross streets are spaced so wagons can turn easily. The depot will stand close to the center, facing what will become the main street. The yards will stretch to the east where there is space for long strings of cars. To the west he reserves ground for an engine house and repair shops. He chooses each location with an eye to drainage, prevailing winds, and the need to keep sparks from locomotives away from piles of lumber and stacked freight. Surveyors set up transits and start driving stakes. The sharp tap of hammers carries in the dry air. Men mark lot corners with wooden posts and tie bits of cloth to them for visibility. Chainmen walk back and forth, calling out distances in flat voices. Dodge moves among them, checking bearings and lengths. A town cannot be allowed to grow random if it is to serve the railroad properly. The grid must be consistent so that switching moves, warehouse placement, and future sidings can all be plotted without guesswork. South of the chosen depot site, Crow Creek bends. Dodge watches the water for a long moment. In summer it is low and lazy, but men in his party who have wintered nearby tell him how sudden storms can turn such channels into dangerous flows. He orders that streets near the creek be laid out with enough setback that floods will not wash away houses pressed too close to the bank. At the same time, he insists that the railroad's own structures sit high enough that drifting ice or debris will not undercut foundations. In the heat of the day, General Augur rides in from his temporary headquarters in the fledgling settlement. With him come staff officers and an escort. Their horses sweat and toss their heads, unused to the thin air and lack of shade. Dodge meets them near the surveyed bridge site. The two men talk standing in the open, hats pulled down, coats unbuttoned. There is no tent big enough out here to seat both the army and the railroad, and neither man wants the distance that cloth walls would impose. Their subject is the fort that the army will build to protect this stretch of track and the town forming beside it. Augur explains that he plans to set the post several miles west on higher ground, where the garrison can look down toward the railroad and toward the open country where raiding parties might gather. The site will give troops a clear field of movement in any direction, and enough room for stables, parade ground, and storehouses. Dodge listens, asks about water sources, and nods. For his purposes, the key is simple. Soldiers must be close enough to respond to threats along the right-of-way, but not so close that drunken brawls between enlisted men and railroad workers become a constant drain on order. He and Augur agree that the railroad will run a spur toward the quartermaster depot that will sit near the fort. That depot, later called Camp Carlin, will receive large shipments of food, forage, and ammunition for the army in this sector. Dodge wants the spur because it allows him to move supplies inland with fewer wagons. Every mile that freight can travel on rails instead of wheels saves animals and men. A military storehouse well supplied from the tracks also reduces the chances that army units will strip railroad camps of food during shortages. Once the army party rides away, Dodge turns his attention back to his own camp. He walks through the temporary tent rows where railroad clerks, surveyors, and a few early merchants sleep. The wind has picked up, blowing dust against canvas and into every seam. Men squint and pull scarves over their mouths. A cook curses as grit blows into his kettles. The same wind that will help clear smoke from future locomotives makes every open pot and open eye vulnerable out here. Beyond the survey camp, another set of tents has started to rise, less orderly. Gambling tables sit under sagging canvas. Kegs are rolled into holes and covered to hide them from any passing officer who might take offense. Women in bright dresses move among the rough structures. These are the advance elements of the kind of settlement Dodge has seen trailing the line across Nebraska, rough places that provide whiskey, cards, and flesh for laborers and drifters. The men who run these outfits follow the track like traders follow an army. Dodge cannot wish them away, but he can insist that they stay off company lots and out of the path of the future yards. He orders stakes driven to mark the railroad's reserved ground clearly. When a tent or shanty appears too close to those markers, his agents give the occupants notice to move. Sometimes the order is enough. Sometimes it takes a crew of men with axes and ropes to drag a structure to a new site. He wastes no sympathy on those who complain. The railroad is the only reason this town will exist, and its needs come first in his thinking. As the day passes, more survey lines are run. Men measure out blocks where warehouses will stand. Others sketch the position of a turntable, essential at a division point where locomotives must be turned and serviced. Dodge demands room for water tanks and coal sheds on the approach track so engines can refill without tying up the main line. He chooses a site for a telegraph office with clear sight lines to both east and west, knowing that the wire will be his main tool for controlling the flow of trains and construction traffic. He spends part of the afternoon riding a short distance out from the chosen town site in each direction. To the east, the land drops back toward the lower plains. The existing line under construction inches its way toward this new point, still many miles away. To the west, the ground rises, and in the far distance the ridgeline darkens. Those mountains will demand heavy grading, deep cuts, and high trestles. Dodge imagines the pattern of work ahead, survey stakes climbing into rocks and timber, bridge gangs perched over ravines, track crews breathing even, thinner air as they drive rails over the crest toward the Green River country. Cheyenne, as the name will shortly be fixed by the company, will be the hinge between the plains stretch and that mountain work. Dodge thinks of it in those functional terms, a hinge, a joint that must not fail under load. Locomotives will arrive here from the east, hot from the run, needing water, repairs, and new crews. Freight will be sorted here for distribution along the harder grades ahead. Troops, when needed, will move here by rail and then fan out by horse. For all of that to work, the town must have ordered yards, reliable shops, and a stock of materials stored under control, not scattered among speculative shacks. Within days, the first permanent structures begin to rise according to his plat. Frame buildings go up along the proposed main street. Rough boards form walls. Roofs are nailed down with whatever shingles or tarred paper can be had. A land office opens early, recording claims on lots that Dodge's surveyors marked. Sawmills start near the creek, blades ripping through cottonwood logs dragged from nearby channels and draws. The noise of hammers, saws, and shouted orders becomes constant. He keeps track of each railroad structure with the same care he gives to track mileage. The depot must be framed, roofed, floored, and ready to receive passengers and freight before the first train arrives later in the year. The roundhouse foundation must be poured and its walls raised in time to shelter locomotives from winter winds. Machine shops must have their heavy tools installed and tested. Dodge reviews progress each evening around a table covered with rough plans and tally sheets, then sends instructions back along the telegraph to Omaha for any missing machinery, ironwork, or timbers. News of the chosen site spreads faster than the railroad itself. By late summer, wagons roll in from distant settlements bringing merchants, tradesmen, prostitutes, gamblers, and families who hope to open boarding houses or small stores. Tents give way to low wooden fronts painted with large signs advertising liquor, hardware, food, and clothing. Streets that yesterday held only survey stakes now see dust rising from constant traffic. The place begins to earn the reputation that will cling to it, a city that seemed to appear almost overnight, driven by the railroad's decision to stop here long enough to build a base. Dodge cares little for the nickname or the civic pride that will later tie to it. What matters to him is that the town now has the facilities he needs. When rails finally reach Cheyenne in November, locomotives roll into a yard that can receive them. Fuel stands ready, water columns are in place, and repair crews have benches, tools, and lathes under roof. The depot can handle passengers without forcing them to stand in open wind. Telegraph instruments click in a solid building rather than in a tent that flaps in every gust. Beyond the town's edge, the Army follows through on its own plan. Soldiers arrive on the chosen high ground west of Crow Creek and start building Fort D.A. Russell, They raise barracks, stables, and storehouses, laying them out with the same rigid order Dodge favors in his yards. Cannon are mounted to cover approaches. Patrols begin to ride the surrounding country, watching for any sign that war parties might gather to strike at bridges, isolated grading camps, or the town itself. The fort's presence gives Dodge more confidence that his line through this exposed region can be kept in operation once it is laid. He works with the quartermaster officers to coordinate freight deliveries. Cars loaded with army rations, ammunition, and forage are cut from passing trains and switched onto the spur toward the depot near the fort. Empty cars are hauled back promptly, ready for reuse. Dodge insists that military freight be handled with the same punctual schedule as company material. Every delay on a siding ties up track space and locomotive time that he cannot spare. As the year turns cold, Cheyenne stands as a rough but functioning center. The wind grows sharper, snow squalls sweep across the town without warning, and temperatures drop. Railroad crews learn how quickly bare iron cools skin here, how fast exposed water freezes in tanks and lines. Locomotive crews adapt, keeping steam up even when standing in the yard so cylinders do not chill solid. Shops burn extra coal to keep tools and men working. Dodge monitors these small adaptations because they signal whether this high plain base can sustain year-round operations. For him, the decision he made that July morning at Crow Creek has paid out in new leverage over the mountains. With a division point fixed here, he can assign separate construction forces east and west of the town, each with its own timetables and supply lists, but both drawing strength from the same yards and depots. Steel, timber, and food arrive here by rail and then spread along the advancing front. Telegraph messages centralize here before going on toward Omaha, or forward to the latest camp in the hills. At the end of one long day spent reviewing yard layouts and shop progress, Dodge stands on a slight rise just outside the town limits and looks over what has been created in a few months. The creek bends below. The grid of streets, still mostly rutted dirt, runs in straight lines across the rise. Black smoke from locomotives and shop chimneys drifts low in the evening air. Bugle calls carry faintly from the fort's direction. He sees not a finished city, but a tool in working order, a base that allows the railroad to press against the Laramie Mountains with a steady flow of men and material. What began as a mark on his survey map has become a solid hinge between the plains already conquered by iron and the hard country still ahead. In the early hours of August 7, 1867, the stretch of track near Plum Creek lay quiet under a gray sky. The night wind had dropped, leaving only the faint creak of cooling iron and the distant call of prairie birds. By first light, the silence broke under the sound of horse hooves and the crack of distant shots. When the news finally reached the forward camps, it came as a blunt report. A freight train west of Plum Creek had been pulled from the rails and destroyed. Men were dead. Cars had been looted and set on fire. Telegraph messages from that section had stopped. Grenville M. Dodge received the first clear account later that morning in a dusty office beside the track farther east. The telegraph operator passed him slips covered in hurried pencil. Dispatches from stations near the wreck described a twisted mass of iron, scorched ties, and scattered freight. Survivors who had walked in spoke of rails pried loose and bent aside, of stock cars opened and emptied, and of bodies left beside the right-of-way. There were signs that more than one war party had taken part, riders from different bands drawn by the exposed moving target the railroad had become. Dodge read each message twice, jaw set, then began to ask the questions that mattered most to him. How long was the break in the line? How many rails had been torn out? Was the bridge near that point intact? Were any of the telegraph poles still standing? How far away were the nearest construction gangs with tools and material? He knew the human cost was severe and he did not ignore it. but his habit was to see every attack as both a blow and an engineering problem. If the railroad halted for long, every camp, every grading crew, and every town along the line would feel it. He left at once in a locomotive with a short escort. The train moved west as fast as the track allowed, whistles sounding at every curve. When they reached the last intact station before the wreck, Dodge stepped down into air that smelled of burned wood and spilled grain. The sun was high now, throwing hard light across the country. The station platform held a cluster of shaken men. Some were railroad workers, clothes torn and faces streaked with soot. Others were soldiers from a small detachment that had ridden in after the first alarm. They set out at once along the track on hand cars and on foot. As Dodge neared the site, the damage became visible in pieces. First came lengths of rail lying twisted beside the embankment, red dust clinging to their flanges. Then the charred frames of freight cars, their wood reduced to black ribs, iron bands from barrels and wagon wheels scattered in the grass. Closer in, the heat in the air rose from smoldering timbers. The wreck of the locomotive lay on its side, wheels half buried in torn earth, boiler dented and streaked with soot and rust. The bodies were already being gathered by a detail of men with blankets. Dodge watched them work in silence. Faces were covered. Quickly, limbs straightened as much as possible, and rows formed on a patch of level ground away from the track. The air held the mixed smell of burned cloth, spilled flour, and blood-soaked earth. It was a sight that would stay with any man. Dodge did not let it slow his steps for more than a moment. He moved on to the rail break itself. The raiders had chosen their spot carefully. The grade here ran across a shallow rise with a mild curve. By pulling spikes and dragging out a short run of rails, they could throw a train from the track and leave the cars to pile up in a heap. The embankment fell off sharply on one side, making the fall more damaging. Dodge knelt beside the torn bed and studied the ground. Crowbars had been used. Spikes lay scattered. Ties had been hacked and burned. Telegraph poles nearby had been cut and pushed over. Insulators lay shattered in the dirt, wire coiled loosely around broken wood. He straightened and began to issue orders in a hard, level voice. The first task was to open the line again. Wreckage that still smoldered would have to be pulled clear, even if it meant working among charred remains. Men with hooks and chains began to haul away debris. Wheel sets dragged, squealing across the ballast. Axes bit into burned beams, shovels bit into dirt where the embankment had been torn open. The bodies were carried farther off and placed in a separate area where they could be prepared for burial. Dodge made sure that work parties were divided so no crew was forced to handle both the dead and the wreck for long stretches. He wanted the line mended quickly, but he knew how far he could push men who had just seen what had happened. He sent riders to contact the nearest army post with precise instructions. Patrols were to sweep the surrounding country but not wander so far that the railroad itself was left unguarded. Scouts were to track sign where they could, note the size of the war parties and report back. Dodge's interest was not in revenge raids that might drag out for weeks. He needed to know how many attackers operated in this sector, how they approached the track, and whether they had any pattern in the way they chose their targets. While the search parties rode out, he turned to the telegraph. Men with spare poles and wire had come on the locomotive behind his, anticipating the need. Dodge walked the line where the poles had fallen, noting how many needed complete replacement and where short repairs would be enough. He ordered the crew to restore at least one working circuit as far as the station beyond the wreck before dark. Messages about repairs and train movements had to pass through again if the rhythm of the railroad was to continue. As the day wore on, the sun hardened the ground. Sweat ran in streaks down faces and necks. Shirts stuck to backs. The smell of wet ash and burned grain mixed with the dust kicked up by boots. Dodge moved from one crew to another, checking progress. Ties were laid in fresh rows, where the embankment had been rebuilt. Rails came forward on flat cars pushed by small engines or hand crews. Spikes were driven into wood that still held marks of fire on its ends. Fish plates clamped new joints together. When the first test locomotive eased across the repaired section, Dodge stood beside the track and watched the wheels carefully. The metal groaned, but nothing shifted. The locomotive passed the former break at walking speed, then picked up a little more pace. Behind it, a short train of empty cars rolled through. Men on both sides of the line let out held breath. There would be more work to do, closed inspections and reinforcement, but the essential break had been closed in a single long day. Repairs solved only part of the problem. Dodge knew that unless the pattern of protection changed, the railroad would face the same kind of attack again. That night, seated at a rough table near the track with lanterns swinging overhead, he spread out a map of the line between the Platte towns and the new division point at Cheyenne. He marked every bridge, every water tank, every curve where a train had to slow, every spot where grades and embankments made derailments more damaging. These were the weak points. He then set about turning his wartime habits into a more severe frontier rule. Guard detachments that had been spread thin would be concentrated at the most exposed spots. Small blockhouses and dug-in posts would be authorized near bridges and tanks that still had none. Trains carrying valuable freight would not move through these sectors without some form of armed escort, whether it came from soldiers riding in a designated car or from railroad guards trained and equipped for that duty. Telegraph operators along the line would be given clear instructions on how to signal an attack, using agreed code words that could be tapped quickly under pressure. In the following days, as he moved along the route, Dodge spoke directly with station men and section foremen. He told them what had happened at Plum Creek in plain terms, without embellishment. He made clear that any time a break in communication or a delayed train matched the pattern of that attack, they were to assume the worst and act at once. Repairs were not to wait for higher confirmation. Track crews were to move toward suspected trouble with tools and spare material as soon as word reached them, under guard if needed. At the same time, he refused to let the attack slow the broader advance. Grading and bridging work farther west had to continue. Crews already cutting into the approaches to the Laramie Mountains remained at their tasks. Material trains still pushed toward Cheyenne, though with stricter orders about speed and spacing through certain stretches. Dodge kept the construction schedule firm. Each day lost in the wake of the Plum Creek wreck would multiply into larger delays when winter closed in, or when congressional scrutiny turned again to the railroad's performance. He revisited staffing near the vulnerable towns as well. Section hands who had shown steady nerve during the crisis were promoted to lead small squads of armed track walkers. These men would patrol short distances along the line during troubled periods, checking not only for pulled spikes and loosened rails, but also for signs of tampering with telegraph wires and culverts. Their reports fed back into Dodge's daily assessments of which points needed more reinforcement. The burial of the men killed at Plum Creek took place under a hot sky on ground near the line. Dodge attended briefly. There were few words spoken. The men who lowered the bodies into the earth were often men who had shared cars and camps with them just days before. Afterward, most of those present went straight back to work. It was not coldness. It was an understanding that the only response that mattered in Dodge's eyes was to keep the trains running and the railhead moving. In letters to company leaders and in brief reports to officials in the capital, he described the attack in blunt language and then laid out the measures he had ordered. There was no complaint that the line was too exposed or that the threat was beyond his reach. He wrote about block points, escort practices, and repair timetables. He requested additional weapons and, where possible, more soldiers along critical lengths of track. The tone of those communications was the same as his engineering notes. A problem had appeared. Steps were being taken to address it without slowing overall progress. News of what had happened at Plum Creek spread quickly along the camps. Workers gathered in bunk cars and tents at night and talked about the risk of being caught on a train in a similar attack. Some thought about leaving. Others shrugged and said that danger was part of working on the edge of settlement. Dodge did not try to stir them with speeches. Instead, he made sure they saw the new patrols, the extra pickets near bridges, and the way trains now moved with more caution in exposed sectors. Visible changes mattered more than words in holding a hard workforce together. As the weeks passed, isolated shots and small raids continued in various places, but there was no repeat of the full destruction seen at Plum Creek on that scale. Trains passed the rebuilt section daily, wheels clattering over the same ground where the burned cars had once stood. Construction outfits moved farther west, focusing on cuts, fills, and trestles between Cheyenne and the rising ground beyond. Yet Dodge carried the image of that wreck with him on every inspection tour. For him, Plum Creek fixed a lesson he had already begun to learn. On this railroad, there was no clear line between war and construction. Every mile of track demanded not only grading, iron, and ties, but also watchfulness, garrisons, and fast repair tactics. His method of building a mile of road a day had to live inside that reality. The crews he drove across the plains did, not just outrun deadlines and weather. They worked knowing that at any point the line behind them might be cut and that the only barrier between a moving train and another wreck was the system he had built to detect and repair damage at once. March 8, 1869. Morning hangs low over Ogden, Utah territory, with thin clouds filtered across the sky and a cold dampness rising from the nearby Weber and Ogden rivers. The town sits on a flat spread of ground between the Wasatch Front and the marshes that edge the north side of Great Salt Lake. Most of its buildings are still 1- and 2-story frame structures, scattered around dusty streets that turn to ruts after every storm. Small farm plots and orchards run out toward the foothills. Smoke from cook stoves and blacksmith forges curls above roofs and drifts toward the empty plain to the west, where survey stakes and rough grade mark the approaching railroad. Word has gone out through the day before that the Union Pacific rails will enter town today. Long before the first hammer rings on track near the limits, people begin to gather along the marked line. School children form in lines behind their teachers, paper banners in their hands. Town leaders in dark coats brushed clean for the occasion take positions on a simple reviewing stand thrown up beside the right-of-way. A brass band tunes its instruments, breath steaming in the cold air, notes wobbling as men adjust valves and reeds. Out on the edge of town, the construction gang has been at work since first light. Graders finished this stretch days earlier, shaping the roadbed to the profile company engineers demanded. But the last rails remain to be laid. Now the horse that pulls the small rail car moves at a measured walk along the iron, the car loaded with bars and joint pieces. Men cluster around it, faces roughened by months in Weber Canyon and the open country east of it. They are used to building line in rock chutes and narrow benches. Running into a level town street feels almost easy by comparison, but there is no change in the way they work. The foreman calls the next length. Lifters grip the ends of a rail. Others fall in along its side. At the word, they raise it clear of the car and carry it forward, boots scuffing the compacted earth. Tie setters have already dropped and squared their pieces on the last stretch inside the town limits. The rail drops into place. Gaugers move in, bars scraping the metal as they check the distance between lines. Spikers step up, hammers swinging in practice strokes. The sharp sound carries toward the waiting crowd and bounces back from the low fronts of houses and stores. Behind the gang, a small locomotive stands under steam, its pilot just short of the last jointed rail. Smoke and steam drift around its stack and dome. The engine's crew watch the men ahead with tight attention. As soon as enough solid iron lies in front of them, they will edge the machine forward into Ogden, the first full locomotive to appear here out of the east. Grenville M. Dodge rides in the cab of that engine. He has come down from the active front in Weber Canyon for this day, leaving instructions with his assistants on blasting, tunnel work, and protection along the narrow gorge. The call from Ogden is not sentimental. This place has grown in his calculations for months as the key operating point between the mountains and the desert country beyond. Now that the rails are about to enter, he wants his own eyes on every decision. He stands on the engineer's side, gloved hand resting on the cab frame, eyes narrowed on the track gang. He notes each motion as if he has never seen such work before, even though he has watched this same pattern repeated over plains, over passes, and through canyons. The gang moves with the same rhythm he and the Casement brothers drilled into them years ago near Omaha. Specialized squads handle each task. No one steps in another man's way. Tools are passed and replaced without confusion. As the last few rail lengths go down within town, the noise from the waiting crowd grows. The band begins to play a march, the sound rough but loud. Children wave banners lettered with slogans the town leaders chose, messages welcoming the railroad and declaring hopes for trade and prosperity. Women lean forward from the edges of boardwalks, shawls tight around their shoulders. Farmers in worn coats hold their hats in their hands. A few soldiers from nearby posts, uniforms patched and dusty, stand with arms folded, looking as much at the people as at the approaching locomotive. When the foreman raises his arm to signal that the line is secure to the stand, the engineer looks to Dodge. Dodge gives a short nod. The engineer eases the throttle open. The locomotive begins to move, wheels turning slowly. Each joint passes under the pilot, then the drivers, then the tender. The machine rolls into Ogden at a deliberate pace, not racing but showing its weight and presence with every foot. The band's tune shakes. Some players lose the beat as they stare. Children cheer, voices thin but fierce. From the platform by the track, a local official steps forward and raises his arms. Shouts of welcome rise around him. A long banner on the stand carries a bold greeting, hailing the road as the great route of nations, and bidding it welcome into the territory. Town newspapers will later record the exact words, but Dodge pays them little attention just now. When the locomotive stops opposite the stand, he steps down from the cab to the packed dirt, boots striking solid ground. He tips his hat once toward the assembled crowd and then turns his head to take in the setting in every direction. To the east, the line runs back through the Weber country he has only recently forced his way through. To the west, surveyors' stakes and rough grade run toward Bear River, Corinne, and the contested approaches to Promontory. North and south, he sees level enough land for sidings, yards, and depots. The Ogden River and streams from the canyons promise reliable water. Local leaders approach, hands extended. Dodge takes them, but his greetings are brief. They speak of what the railroad will do for Ogden, the freight it will bring, the visitors, the link to territories far away. He listens just long enough to be polite. His own questions are different. He wants to know about land titles near the tracks, about who owns which parcels on either side of the main line, about the availability of timber and stone for station buildings, shops, and roundhouse foundations. He asks where town roads flood in spring, how often the rivers rise, how hard the wind blows down from the Wasatch in winter. Once the short formalities end, he walks the length of the new track through town with his field book open. An assistant notes his comments in a tight hand. Dodge points out where the main depot should stand. Close enough to the central street to serve passengers, but clear of any low ground that will turn to mud. He marks ground for a freight house and open platforms where wagons can roll on and off without blocking the main. He chooses a site for an engine house and repair tracks close to water and coal stores, but far enough from dwellings that noise and smoke will not cause constant friction with residents. He insists on room for a broad yard. Ogden, in his mind, cannot be only another stop. It must be a place where long trains are broken down, cars switched, and new consists made up for runs in several directions. He wants enough parallel tracks that freight can be sorted without keeping passenger trains waiting on the main line. He has seen earlier towns choke their own growth by allowing haphazard sidings and cramped depots. Here, with much of the ground still open, he intends to fix a pattern that can expand as traffic increases. Surveyors begin to set stakes in the positions he selects. The hammering of wooden posts into soil resumes, echoing faintly off the low buildings. Dodge follows them, checking compass bearings and pacing off distances. He does not draw careful diagrams himself. Instead, he gives exact instructions and trusts his trained men to turn those instructions into proper plats. The process resembles what he did at Crow Creek when he set the shape of Cheyenne, but Ogden holds a different weight. This town will not be a temporary division point that can wither if the line shifts. It stands beside rich farmland and near the main route to Salt Lake City. It will be a permanent junction. By midday, the celebration has thinned. Some residents return to homes and shops. The band puts away instruments. A few speeches are given from the platform, praising the enterprise and the workers who drove iron across half a continent. Dodge listens for a moment from a distance. When his name is mentioned and cheers rise, he inclines his head once. Recognition has never been his goal. What matters to him is that trains continue to arrive and depart here on an orderly schedule, with freight fees collected and operating costs kept under control. Through the afternoon, he meets with representatives of the Mormon contractors who graded much of the line in Utah. They sit with him at a rough table in a room near the tracks, maps and contracts spread between them. They speak of completed work in Weber Canyon and beyond, of unpaid balances, of disagreements over measurement. Dodge hears their claims and notes the sums involved. He knows the company's finances are strained and that Durant and other directors have already tangled with these men over payment. He cannot cure all of that in one day, but he can at least confirm the engineering facts. Where the grades are sound and built to spec, he marks that in his reports. Where work falls short, he will say so just as plainly. As darkness approaches, he boards a small train to the east, bound first for the canyon and then, within days, for the long journey back to Washington. Telegraph messages from the capital have already warned him that disputes over the meeting point between his road and the Central Pacific must be settled in person. Grading crews from both companies are working west from Ogden and east from Monument Point, sometimes crossing lines and throwing up parallel beds. The waste is obvious. The risk of a political reversal that could damage Union Pacific's position is just as clear. The short trip back through Weber Canyon to the existing temporary headquarters gives him time to think. At stations along the way, he sees freshly painted signs with new mileages. He knows that somewhere behind him in that gorge stands the marked tree at the 1,000-mile point. Now Ogden has become another figure in his tally, 1,000 and more miles from the Missouri and still under his system of car counts, supply rules, and marching gangs. Within days, he leaves the rough camps and boards faster trains eastward, moving back over the very line he has spent years pushing forward. The coaches are warmer than any bunk car, but he sleeps in short segments only, rising often to look through the windows at the towns the railroad has built or enlarged. Cheyenne, Laramie, the settlements along the Platte, the river crossing at Omaha. At each stop, local officials want a word. He keeps those exchanges brief. His attention is already on the arguments waiting in Washington offices. In early April, he sits across a table from Central Pacific Director Collis P. Huntington and government commissioners in a room not far from the federal departments that oversee railroad charters. The air smells of paper, ink, and the coal smoke that seeps into every building in the city. Outside, carriages clatter over early spring mud. Inside, the talk is direct and often tense. Huntington presses the Central Pacific's claim to the ground between Ogden and Promontory. His engineers and Mormon contractors occupy much of the grade in that sector. Dodge presents the Union Pacific position with the same plain delivery he uses at a work site. His road has reached Ogden first. His track layers are pushing toward Corinne. His supply trains are running along more than 1,000 miles of finished line. He lays out in detail how far his gangs can advance in the short weeks before the agreed deadline for joining rails. The commissioners listen, weighing not only law and charters but also the practical question of how to end a race that has already produced overlapping grades and repeated cuts. Dodge offers a clear solution. Fix a single meeting point on the high ground at Promontory Summit. Order Union Pacific grading west of that point stopped and Central Pacific grading east of a corresponding point halted as well. Allow the Central Pacific by later arrangement to control the line from Promontory back to Ogden for operating purposes, but recognize Union Pacific's completed track and work in the calculations. Huntington objects, calculates, and argues, but he knows as well as Dodge that the two roads must reach some settlement or invite a harsher decision from Congress or the executive departments. After hours of talk, drafting, and redrafting, an agreement takes shape. The lines will meet on the Promontory, within a set distance west of Ogden. Union Pacific will cease work beyond Summit under government order. Central Pacific will stop pushing its grade toward Ogden from the west side. Further details about payments and control will be worked out in follow-up negotiations, but the main question is answered. For Dodge, the key fact is this. Ogden will stand as the place where through trains from east and west are balanced and exchanged, even if the final legal control of the track between it and Promontory shifts. That matches his sense of the land and the traffic. Ogden has the room, the water, and the position to serve as a long-term junction. The agreement he signs his name under aligns the political record with the practical geography he has been shaping since he first sketched yard sites there. Once the documents are complete, he sends telegraph messages west. Crews graded beyond Promontory on Union Pacific account are to stop and move to other sectors. Work aimed at extending the line past the summit will be suspended. Resources freed in that way are to be concentrated on finishing the agreed approach, completing bridges, and tightening the track that leads to the meeting ground. He also sends specific instructions to his operating staff. Schedules for trains into and out of Ogden are to be drawn with its future role in mind, with yard capacity expanded as soon as materials and men can be assigned. He does not linger in Washington any longer than necessary. Once the main issues are settled, he turns around and heads back along the rails he helped place, this time with the assurance that the remaining work has a fixed goal, and that his chosen junction at Ogden will not be erased by last-minute political maneuver. The great race west is not yet over, but its endpoint is now fixed by signatures as well as survey stakes. When he steps again onto the platforms and ballast of Utah, the yards at Ogden are no longer only lines on his field book pages. Grading for sidings has begun. Foundations for shops and an improved depot are going in. Cars stand on freshly laid tracks in the growing yard waiting for assignment. Local traffic has already increased as freight comes in from nearby settlements for shipment east, and goods from the states arrive in crates and barrels. Soldiers, merchants, and migrants use the new station as a starting point for journeys deeper into the interior. For Grenville M. Dodge, the combination is clear. His method of driving track forward at a near mile a day whenever ground allowed has carried iron all the way from the Missouri bluffs to this junction city. His insistence on orderly yards, clear authority in the field, and tight telegraph control has turned Ogden from a farm town into a working center in a matter of weeks. His blunt negotiation in Washington has fixed where his road will meet its western partner and how trains will move between them. The railroad is no longer just a construction project. It is an organized system stretching across the interior with Ogden as one of its key joints, locked in place by the same relentless habits that pushed rails through mud, granite, and canyon walls. January 15, 1869. Snow lies in strips along the floor of Weber Canyon in Utah Territory, packed against the shaded sides of the rock walls and crusted along the edge of the Weber River. The air is cold and wet, carrying the smell of stone, smoke from low campfires, and the sour trace of sweat from men who have worked through the winter. On the narrow shelf carved between the river and the cliffs, graders swing picks and shovels, cutting the last humps down to the line their survey stakes have fixed. This place bears no likeness to the broad Platte country Dodge's men crossed the year before. Here the canyon walls rise steep and close. Every stroke of a tool and every shout bounces back almost at once from bare rock. The river runs tight against the grade, brown and fast, with ice in its back eddies and driftwood lodged against boulders. There is no wide room for teams to swing. Wagons squeeze between piles of broken stone and timber, wheels scraping rock, drivers holding lines short to keep animals from slipping toward the water. Most of the men on this stretch of Weber Canyon are latter-day Saint laborers working under contracts arranged through Brigham Young and church-linked subcontractors. They have left fields, shops, and herds in the nearby valleys to grade, cut, and blast a route for the Union Pacific. Their teams drag loose rock and earth from fresh cuts, fill hollows, and spread the surface to the profile company engineers demand. Crews are organized by ward and settlement, foremen calling orders to men they already know from chapel and town meetings. Grenville M. Dodge directs this sector as he does the others through a mix of personal inspection and written orders. As chief engineer, he approved this line through Weber Canyon, threading the railroad between high walls rather than sending it on a longer sweep north or south. When schedules allow, he rides up from his forward headquarters to walk pieces of the incomplete grade, stepping around drill holes and fresh cracks in the rock. The reports he reads and the ground he sees match. To keep the road moving here, his mile-a-day tactics from the plains must be compressed into a tighter, risk-filled space. Blasting has already forced short tunnels into the canyon sides and opened ledges where none existed. Ahead of the graders, drill crews stand on planks fastened to the rock, swinging hammers in short, measured strokes as they drive steel into marked faces. Charges of black powder and nitroglycerin rest in guarded stores, watched by men who have learned quickly that careless handling kills without warning. Several workers in this canyon and in other hard rock cuts along the route have died under flying stone or explosions that went off too soon. Their names appear in Dodge's records as brief entries, but along the grade their absence is marked by gaps in long familiar gangs. On this January day, a grading party works into a constricted stretch known as Wilhelmina's Pass. The rock relaxes for a short distance, leaving a slightly broader bench between river and wall. There a lone pine stands near the line, trunk straight, branches high above the work at hand. It has been spared so far because it stands just off the center of the cut and offers no obstacle to the shovelmen. Chainmen move through this pass with their instruments measuring distance from established points behind them. They lay out the chain along the grade, record the figures, and match them against the official mileage tables that start at Omaha and run west along the surveyed route. When they add the new numbers, the result draws them together. According to their measurement, the spot beside the pine lies exactly 1,000 miles from the eastern terminus on the Missouri River. The discovery moves quickly along the shelf. Men set down tools for a moment and walk over to look. The tree itself gives no sign of its new meaning. It is one surviving pine among others that used to stand in this gorge, bark scarred by weather, roots clutching thin soil over stone. The measurement changes that. It now marks a precise point in the road's progress, 1,000 miles of graded and finished line between this canyon and the bluffs above the Missouri where Dodge once talked roots with Lincoln and later set his headquarters. Dodge's engineers treat the fact as more than a curiosity. Surveyors note the exact position in their books. Profiles and maps receive a clear mark at this location. A simple board is prepared and hung on the trunk, painted in plain letters to state that this is 1,000 miles from Omaha. As track and train crews come through later, the tree will acquire a name, the 1,000-mile tree, and photographers will carry away images of it standing by the rails. For the men who first mark it, it is a fixed point in their work and another line in Dodge's ledgers, proof that his system has driven the road that far into the mountains. The rails themselves have not yet touched the tree. They are still working their way through sections of canyon where the grade is ready and the tunnels are open enough to pass construction traffic. Dodge has kept the spacing between gangs tight in this country. There is no room for long stretches of idle graded line between crews as there was on the prairie. Tunnel work, bridge framing, cutting, and track laying overlap in short sections. When rock or weather stalls one part, the rest must continue without waiting. It is the only way to maintain progress in ground that can close with a single slide or flood. Within days, the head of track pushes toward the marked pine. A construction train comes up as far as finished iron allows and squeezes into a siding cut against the bank. Its cars fill the shelf. Boxcars hold rails, tie plates, spikes, bolts, and tools in the same ordered fashion Dodge laid out years earlier. Flat cars carry bundled ties cut and shaped downriver. A shop car provides a cramped space where broken tools and bent fittings can be repaired without sending them back to a permanent shop. Farther back, kitchen and bunk cars for casements crews stand with stovepipes smoking into the cold air. Beyond the end of finished iron, the grade bends through rock outcrops and runs hard against the river. The working surface is little wider than the ties themselves. The horse that pulls the small rail car walks along the laid track with less than the length of a hand between its side and the canyon wall. Men on the load duck under bulging rock as the car moves forward. When it stops, lifters take their places along each rail, boots braced on rough ground, knowing that a misstep here will not send them into soft earth but toward water and stone. Tie setters work just ahead of them, dropping timbers on the prepared bed at regulated intervals and squaring them by eye and rule. They feel the uneven grade through their soles, firm on one step, slick where seepage from the wall has soaked the fill on the next. Gaugers follow the rail carriers, measuring the span between lines with bars and dragging the iron into alignment against resistances different from prairie soil. Spikers swing with one foot on a tie and the other against rock, shoulders scraping the wall as they raise and drive their hammers. Every move is constrained by stone on one side and water on the other. Sound in the canyon is hard and close. Each hammer stroke rings against the walls and comes back at once. The clatter of rails on skids, the grind of wheel flanges on iron, the barked counts of foremen and the hiss of steam from a waiting locomotive mix into a steady roar that leaves men half shouting even when they talk at night. Farther along the line, telegraph instruments tap and click in cramped stations, carrying Dodge's instructions in and the day's output numbers back out. But at the head of work orders pass from mouth to ear and hand to hand. Behind the track gang, ballast men move in with shovels and tamping bars, working rock into place around the ties and packing it tight under the rail seats. They use stone from nearby cuts, broken down to size with sledges, and haul it in barrows along the same narrow shelf. Ditching crews keep to the outside edge, slicing channels so that meltwater and rain run away instead of soaking the base. The Weber has already shown in other reaches that it can rise fast and tear at embankments when storms upstream send sudden volumes down the gorge. Dodge has ordered culverts and spill channels laid stoutly here to match that behavior, and he expects to see them in place on every inspection. In spite of all this complication, his expectations on distance are unchanged. Whenever the terrain gives even a short run of workable ground, he still calls for close to a mile of track in a day's labor by a full gang. In Weber Canyon, the hard work of tunnels and heavy cuts down the number of such days, but the rhythm when they come is the same that he drove on the plains. Graders move as far ahead as the rock allows. Bridge carpenters follow, spanning side ravines and reinforcing bank edges. Track layers and ballast men press behind them. Telegraph clerks in the nearest station assemble figures on footage gained, blasts fired, and rails laid and send them on. Late in one of those days, the head of iron reaches the 1,000-mile tree itself. Light drops lower, leaving the canyon floor in early shadow while the tops of the walls still show pale. The last section of rail for that run rides up on the horse car and is slid down onto skids near the new ties that already run almost to the trunk. Men are worn down from hours of lifting and swinging. Hands are cracked and raw from cold and grit. Faces and coats carry a coating of stone dust that no quick wash water can shift. When word passes that the next rail will close the 1,000-mile count, no one suggests leaving it for morning. The gang takes their positions without ceremony. Lifters grip the ends and the sides, boots finding what solid footing they can. They lift on the word and carry the bar forward, shoulders tight, breathing hard in the thin winter air. At the chosen spot, they drop it into place beside its mate. Gaugers step in, checking the span and prying the iron until the distance matches the company's standard. Spikers drive in steady rhythm. 3 firm blows to each spike until heads seat against plates. Bolters follow, fitting fish plates and tightening nuts until joints close. When the work is done and tools are lifted clear, the iron runs past the pine that graders measured days earlier. The sign on the trunk states the fact in blunt words that this point stands 1,000 miles from Omaha. Some men stand a moment and look at it, reading the letters through dust-filmed eyes. A few reach out and touch the bark once, then turn toward camp. Others walk away without pause, more interested in food and blankets than in a number. That night, a telegraph message from the nearest station carries the news forward. Dodge enters the distance and date in his tables and moves on to the next set of demands. Traffic follows close behind. A light locomotive eases up to the new stretch before full dark, pushing a short train ahead. The engine creeps between the canyon walls, exhaust echoing off rock. Wheels cross the fresh joints near the tree and roll on toward other unfinished pieces of line where temporary tracks still edge around tunnel sites and men still hang on ropes to plant charges. The new rail holds. In the days ahead, freight and supply trains will use the same route, bringing more material, food, and tools into the canyon. The pine and its nailed sign become a fixed landmark in operating routine. Latter-day Saint workers carve initials into its bark when they find a few spare minutes. Passengers on later trains lean from car windows as conductors pointed out during the climb and descent along the Wasatch Grade. Photographers haul cameras and glass plates up the line to capture views of the tree, the track, and the men scattered along the slopes. For Dodge, these images and stories register only as side notes. The tree's real importance lies in the fact that it marks the point where his system of surveying, grading, supply, and disciplined gangs has pushed the Union Pacific 1,000 miles west from the river. By the time rails reach Ogden in early March, Weber Canyon is still not finished in any comfortable sense. Tunnels remain to be lined and cleaned. Rock faces above the line need more benches and retaining work, and culverts must be watched every time water rises. Nitroglycerin and powder blasts continue to open stubborn sections. Heavy storms send sudden flows down the Weber that gnawed embankments and filled ditches with debris. Maintenance gangs live almost permanently in the gorge, ready to clear slides and shore up weakened spots before they can interrupt regular trains. Dodge reads the daily reports from this sector with close attention. Weber Canyon stands as a hard test of his method, a place where a railroad driven at speed has to survive in constricted, unstable ground. Here, his mile-a-day tactic is tied to constant repair and inspection. If his organization can hold this narrow passage open through winter and flood while still pressing west toward the desert meeting ground, then the plains behind and the easier valleys ahead will stay locked in. The pine with its simple board tells every crew and traveler the exact distance from Omaha. The real measure is that trains keep rolling past it. Proof that the same relentless system that counted out those 1,000 miles can carry the road through rock and water without losing the forward motion that began years earlier on the Missouri bluffs. May 10, 1869. Thin ice still clings to shaded pools on the high ground of Promontory Summit, but the sun already has real heat. The ridge is a bare spine of gravel and clay patched with sage and low brush. Around it, brown hills roll away toward distant snow on the Wasatch, and a pale band where the Great Salt Lake lies flat in the basin. The wind is light for once, carrying dust instead of grit whipped hard enough to sting. For weeks, men from both directions have been closing in on this spot. From the west, Central Pacific crews have cut through the Sierra Nevada and battled snowsheds and drifts. From the east, Grenville M. Dodge's organization has dragged iron over the Platte Plains, across the Laramie Highlands, through the Green River country, and into the desert. Now only a short gap in the railhead remains between the last Union Pacific joint bar and the final Central Pacific iron. That space holds a few lengths of tie and bare earth, and on this morning it also holds a crowd. Promontory has no town in any settled sense. A cluster of tents and shacks stands near the grade, together with a telegraph car, a few commissary wagons, and the rough platforms the two companies have thrown up for the day. A pair of locomotives face each other over the gap, one from each road, polished more carefully than usual, brass and paint scrubbed and oiled. Between them, crews have laid a polished laurel tie and set out special spikes for the ceremony. Around that centerpiece, dozens of ordinary iron spikes lie ready in kegs and boxes. They will hold trains in place long after the fancy pieces are removed to be shown elsewhere. Grenville Dodge stands a little back from the group of dignitaries. He wears a dark coat and a broad-brimmed hat, boots dusty from riding the line that morning to make sure the approaches on his side show no weakness. Thomas Durant is here, restless and loud. Central Pacific's leaders, including Leland Stanford and engineers from their side, stand near the laurel tie. Army officers, territorial officials, newspapermen, and invited guests cluster around them. Chinese laborers from the west and Irish and other track men from the east form a loose ring farther out, watching. Telegraph wires run into the small car that serves as an office. Inside, operators sit with keys ready. The line has been prepared to send a single word across the country when the last stroke falls. A brief message that will let people in far cities hear almost at once that the continent's first continuous rail link has been finished. Dodge has spent enough years with telegraph instruments in his war work and railroad campaigns that the sound of clicking keys feels normal to him. This morning he wants them to say only one thing, that the task he took on at Omaha 3 years earlier has reached this junction. The ground underfoot is packed and uneven, scuffed by thousands of boots and hooves. The air smells of coal smoke, sweat, horse, and the strong resin of the new ties. Men speak in low tones near Dodge, trading remarks about missed deadlines, land grants, and stock prices. He lets the talk wash past. His eyes stay on the rails, on the joint where iron from the east will meet iron from the west, and on the ordinary workers who linger just beyond the ring of invited guests. Their faces sunburned, hands scarred from years of timber, rock, and steel. The ceremony proceeds in fits and starts. Speeches drag longer than Dodge would prefer. Words rise about national unity, enterprise, and destiny. A minister offers a prayer. Flags stir in the light wind. Stanford and Durant step forward in their turn, lifting hammers to tap at the ceremonial spikes. Their blows glance, striking the laurel tie more than the gold and silver metal. The showpieces will be wired up for display and sent away. Dodge's interest rests with the men waiting with regular iron and real sledgehammers a few yards back. When the formalities end, Dodge moves closer to the practical work. Track layers from both roads step in with ordinary ties and spikes. They pull the laurel tie aside, set standard timbers, and position the last few sections of rail. Union Pacific men line up to drive their spikes on one side, Central Pacific men on the other. Hammers rise and fall in the solid cadence Dodge has heard since the first trials near Omaha. Gaugers check the distance between the rails, gauges scraping the metal until the measure fits. Bolters kneel at the joint, sliding on fish plates and tightening nuts with wrenches until the gap between the two roads closes in a piece of hardware no different from thousands of others along the line. Near the telegraph car, an operator watches for the agreed signal. When the last spike is seated and the joint made secure, someone raises a hand. The key begins to move. The message that goes east and west is short, telling stations along the wires that the last rail is laid and the last spike driven. In cities hundreds and thousands of miles away, bells ring, guns fire, and people gather around bulletin boards. Dodge does not see any of that. He watches only the men stepping back from the finished joint, sweat on their faces despite the mild day, tools hanging loose at their sides. 2 locomotives roll forward, one from each direction, until their pilots nearly touch over the fresh tie line. Crews climb into the cabs and onto the fronts. Men stand on the cow catchers, caps in their hands. Dignitaries mount the locomotives and pose. Photographers fuss with tripods and plates, counting off seconds in their heads while everyone holds still. When the shutters finally close, the captured images show polished engines nose to nose and crowded running boards. Dodge appears in some, standing not at center but near the front ranks of railroad officers, expression controlled, shoulders straight. As soon as the photographers have enough exposures, Dodge turns away from the engines and walks along the line of ordinary track leading back toward the east. He steps carefully on the ties, eyes on the rails and the joints. At intervals, he stops to examine the ballast, to look at the ditches and culverts, and to ask nearby foremen about the state of the line in the miles behind. The ceremony on the ridge has changed nothing about his basic demand. Trains must run safely over this joint point from now on, and that means everything around it must be sound. He meets briefly with Samuel Reed and the Casement brothers in a tent near the grade. Around a rough table, they go through the immediate tasks. Construction gangs that have been pushing iron are to be shifted to maintenance and improvement. Some will be released to other lines, the companion routes that will branch south and north from the new main stem. Others will stay on this road, reshaping temporary trestles into heavier bridges, replacing soft ties, widening embankments, and installing sidings in places where early work allowed only a single track. The rolling bunk cars that once pressed toward the railhead will now serve as bases for repair parties. Supply rules also change from that day. Instead of loading trains with rails, spikes, and bridge timbers for open front work, Dodge orders carloads of ballast, spare rails, and replacement ties distributed along the weak sections. Telegraph lines that once leaped forward in long jumps must be thickened into a dense net of stations, each with trained operators and clear schedules. The 40-car calculation he used when pushing the grade across the plains becomes the basis for regular freight consists, tuned to the new pattern of traffic, heavier in some seasons and lighter in others, but always measured. When the meeting breaks up, he walks back toward the summit ridge. A crowd still lingers around the locomotives. Men pass bottles. Voices are louder now. Some laborers shout to friends from the other company, trading insults and rough jokes. Chinese workers stand in small groups, watching but not drawn into the center. Irish gangs from the Union Pacific side and mixed crews from the Central Pacific talk about the months ahead, whether to stay with railroad work or move on to mines, farms, or city labor. Dodge takes in these edges of the gathering without stopping. In the afternoon, a combined train runs over the joined rails, Union Pacific equipment and Central Pacific cars coupled together. It eases across the summit, rolls down the east side toward Ogden, then later heads west toward Sacramento. The trip is not yet a scheduled daily run, but it shows what will soon become routine. Mail cars carry sacks that once rode coaches and stage wagons over rough roads. Baggage cars hold trunks and crates. Passenger coaches seat company officers, officials, and a few paying riders who will later say they were on one of the first through trains across the interior. Dodge analyzes that movement the way he has examined every other. The grades on each side of promontory are not severe, but curves and sand demand respect. He watches the locomotive crews take water, check bearings, and manage their fuel. He listens to their comments about the way the track feels under the wheels, the spots where joints hit harder than they should, the stretches where wind piles dust into the flangeways. He notes each point in his book and directs section men to address them. The rails may now meet, but in his view, the road itself will not be truly finished until it can carry long trains day after day with the same steadiness as the lines he built in war and in the plains. In the weeks that follow, the change spreads outward from the summit as schedules harden into place. Eastbound trains leave California and Nevada loaded with gold, silver, ore, hides, wool, and boxed fruit. Westbound trains from Omaha and the river carry iron goods, farming tools, textiles, finished machinery, and people. Dodge sees reports from division superintendents that detail tonnage, car counts, delays, and mishaps. The numbers show what he expected in outline and what he wants in detail, a growing flood of cargo and passengers moving along the route he plotted years earlier when the Platte was a line in a notebook and Council Bluffs a rough town on a muddy river. Army commanders begin routing troop movements over the new line. Companies that once marched weeks between posts now ride in cramped cars, rifles stacked in baggage corners, knapsacks hanging from hooks. Artillery pieces travel on flat cars instead of grinding down wagon roads. Dodge knows from his wartime experience exactly what that means along the frontier. When trouble flares at a post or in a settlement, reinforcements can now arrive in days instead of months, and supplies of powder, shot, and rations can follow the same path. Cattle outfits and shippers adjust their routes as well. Drives that used to trail herds north or east for months change to runs that end at sidings where stock cars wait. Grain from new farms along the Platte and in the Wyoming valleys moves in bulk, scooped into boxcars and elevator bins instead of being hauled in wagon loads. Timber from the high country comes down by rail to plains towns that once had to cut every stand within reach. Coal moves out from new mines along the line to fuel locomotives and heat buildings in places where firewood was once scarce. Towns that sprang up as track camps now settle into more permanent forms. Cheyenne, Laramie, Rawlins, Green River, Evanston, and others along the way grow heavier structures on the Platte's Dodge's surveyors staked. Yards expand, roundhouses and machine shops multiply stalls, Telegraph offices become busy centers, keys chattering from early morning until late at night. Station agents file regular reports on freight handled, tickets sold, and car shortages. Dodge hears their output through superintendent's summaries and adjusts equipment orders and staffing in response. He does not stay in the field forever. After the line opens and the first surge of post-driving work settles, he spends more time in cities and offices, in meetings about debts, government accounts, and later projects in the South and Southwest. Yet even when he sits at a polished table a long ride from the raw cuts and trestles, his habits remain the same. He asks for exact figures on grades and curvature for any new survey. He demands clear supply tables before approving work on another desert or river crossing. He instructs new engineers to divide labor crews into specialized squads rather than mixed gangs. The pattern he refined between Nashville and Decatur, between Omaha and the 100th meridian, between Cheyenne and Sherman and Weber Canyon, becomes his standing way of doing things. In the years after Promontory, the Union Pacific and connecting lines are reorganized, refinanced, and stretched. Receivership and new owners will come. Dodge will be praised and criticized in turn, held up as the man who drove the road and attacked as one of those who spent money too freely on the race west. None of that alters the fact that the physical line across the interior bears his stamp. The spacing of sidings, the location of division points, the way bridge gangs and section hands think about their work, all reflect the system he imposed when the job could still have failed through scattered effort. On the ground, the most obvious sign of that system's success is not the famous photograph or the polished spikes kept in museums. It is the unremarkable routine of trains appearing on time day after day, in places that once saw only seasonal wagon trains and occasional mail riders. A settler in a new Nebraska town hears the whistle at a set hour each afternoon and trusts that a car with a small crate or a barrel stamped with his name will be on the siding. A miner in Wyoming waits for a car of drilling tools and powder ordered weeks earlier, knowing it has traveled across rivers and ridges on rails Dodge's men laid. A soldier's wife in an eastern city buys a ticket and boards a coach, counting days instead of months to reach a post on the high plains. Near the old Promontory grade, the wind and weather chew at embankments and cuts as they have always done. Maintenance gangs shovel out drifts, clear sand, and tighten joints. Locomotives newer and stronger than the ones that faced each other on May 10 pull heavier strings of cars over the summit. Telegraph wires eventually give way to other means of sending orders, but the idea of a line controlled by fast communication remains central. What Dodge built into his railroad, a constant flow of information to match the flow of iron and wood, continues under different forms. On one later visit west, years after the ceremony, Dodge stands at a siding and watches a freight train pass, loaded with lumber, agricultural machinery, and emigrant cars fitted with crude bunks and stoves. The engine labors on an upgrade, exhaust beating, in steady bursts. Each car rolls in its place, couplers holding tight, wheel flanges singing on the curve. The sight is no longer rare enough to draw crowds. Nearby settlers glance up and then go back to their work. For them, the train is part of the landscape now, as fixed as the distant hills. He reads the scene as confirmation of what he set out to do when he first accepted the chief engineer's job. The railroad is no longer a project gripped by crisis at every trestle and river. It is a running mechanism that consumes coal, steel, and labor every single day, but in return moves the life of a continent in volume that would have been impossible by wagon and stage. His tactic, born from field surveys, war-damaged lines, and hard calculation in plains depots and mountain camps, has turned that mechanism into something that does not stop easily. Promontory Summit itself quiets once the initial rush of travel and freight shifts toward more direct connections. The rails there see less traffic as alternate routes and cutoffs come into service. Sage grows back along parts of the original grade. Yet the joint that was made on that ridge in 1869 endures in the way lines connect across maps. In the habit of seeing the country not as scattered regions but as districts along a main track. Grenville M. Dodge's work history from muddy riverbank surveys to that high, dry ridge has fused into a single fact. The railroad that crosses the heart of the continent runs on a pattern he set, and that pattern has turned it from a dream of a few planners into a force that keeps pushing people, goods, and armies across the Old West long after the last ceremonial spike left the ground, April 23, 1868. Cold air at more than 8,000 feet cuts through wool coats on the ridgeline between Cheyenne and Laramie. The ground around Sherman's summit is bare rock and thin grass, dotted with stunted shrubs and wind-carved boulders. A raw wind blows from the west, steady enough that loose boards rattle and canvas slaps against tent poles. Smoke from locomotive stacks and cook stoves does not rise in straight columns. It flattens and twists, driven sideways along the grade. At the summit itself, the track lies on granite that crews have carved and blasted for months. On both sides of the ridge, long cuts run through solid rock nearly a mile each way. The slopes above them are scarred where explosions have torn out ledges and sent fragments tumbling. Rubble still lies piled where men have not yet finished clearing. The rails at this point rest on ballast that is firm and dry, held between ditches dug to carry off snowmelt and rain. A small station structure, a water tank, and a windmill cluster near the line, along with a few rough buildings that shelter section hands and their families. The place is named Sherman, for William Tecumseh Sherman, and it marks the highest elevation on the Union Pacific. Grenville M. Dodge steps down from a short train that has brought him and a few officers up from Cheyenne. His breath shows in the cold air, even though the calendar says spring. The wind tugs at his coat and hat brim. He stands for a moment with his boots on the rock ballast, eyes on the westward drop. 4 miles beyond lies Dale Creek, a small stream in itself. But at this point, it runs in a deep gap cut into the plateau. Across that gap stands the wooden trestle that has occupied his thoughts all winter. He rides a handcar the remaining distance, pumping alongside section men who know their motions well. As they approach the site, the land falls away. The track runs along a straight embankment, then reaches the head of the gorge. There, the earthwork stops, and the trestle begins. Timber bents rise from the rock far below, piled one above another until they reach the level of the rails. Cross braces tie them in a stiff frame. The bridge stretches hundreds of feet from bank to bank, wood darkened by weather and smoke. Far below, Dale Creek threads among rocks only a few feet wide, its sound lost in the wind. On the east side of the gap, a work camp clings to the slope. Lumber piles, tool racks, and tents stand close together. Carpenters move along the structure, checking joints and tightening bolts. Some work near the deck, adding extra lateral bracing near the rail level. Others climb down ladders and scaffolds fixed to the timber bents, stepping carefully on narrow planks. A temporary guy line, anchored to rock outcrops, runs to the upper parts of the frame to stiffen it against gusts. Dodge climbs a short ladder to the deck of the bridge and walks the length on the ties between the rails. Each step brings a slight movement under his feet. The wind pushes against the high frame, and the tall trestle responds with a slow, uncomfortable sway. It does not feel loose. The timbers hold their shape. Joints creak but do not open. Still, the motion is undeniable. He stops midway and looks down. The drop to the rock below is more than 100 feet. Men who work on the lower braces appear small, like figures in a distant field, even though they are directly below. He calls the bridge foreman over and asks about every element. The bents were prefabricated in the east, shipped in pieces by rail and wagon and assembled on site. Caps, sills, and braces match the standard pattern. Hardware is in place at every joint. The deck timbers are bolted and spike holes checked. The foreman admits that the wind has made the job worse than they expected. On some days, gusts have been strong enough to push men sideways on the scaffold. Lines have been strung to give them something solid to grip. The first train has not yet crossed. That is why Dodge is here. He has no intention of leaving that event to local officers and hearsay. The railroad must carry heavy locomotives and long trains across this point for years. If the first trial fails, the effect on schedules and confidence will be severe. If it succeeds, the road over the Laramie Mountains will effectively be open. He walks off the bridge and gathers the key men, the track supervisor, the bridge foreman, the engineer assigned to run the locomotive, and a small group of section leaders stand near him on the east bank. The wind flattens their coats and pulls at their hair. Dodge lays out the rules in short sentences. The first crossing will be made by a single locomotive and a small number of cars, not a full freight load. Speed on the bridge must be limited to a slow crawl, no more than 4 miles an hour. There will be no stopping on the trestle itself unless an emergency makes it necessary. Men will walk alongside the rails on the deck, watching every joint and brace as the train moves. All unnecessary people are to stay off the structure during the crossing. If there is any sign of failure, the engineer must open the throttle just enough to clear the span before coming to a halt on solid embankment. The engineer listens with a stiff jaw. He has heard tales about this gap from every camp along the line. Some men say the trestle moves so much in a gale that empty cars rock. Others claim that tools left on the deck rolled toward the center. No one wants to be the first to take an engine across. Dodge does not argue with fear. He responds with plain statements. The bridge has been calculated to carry the load. The timber is new and strong. The braces have been checked. Speed will be kept low. Men who ride this line will face other risks on other days. Today, this is the necessary task. While preparations for the trial move forward, Dodge surveys the approaches. On each side of the gorge, the grade has been built with care. Embankments slope cleanly, with ditches on both sides. Ballast rests in an even layer under the ties. Beyond the immediate site, the line falls gently toward Laramie. Crews are already at work there, grading and laying track along the valley that will carry trains toward the Green River country and the Utah line. The fact that the bridge has taken so long and so much effort has not removed his requirement that the railhead keep moving. While carpenters worked here through the winter and early spring, other gangs laid iron toward the summit and beyond, leaving just this gap as the missing link. He thinks in terms of throughput, not isolated feats. Sherman Summit is already a functioning operating point. Locomotives take water from the tank. Crews change here. Trains are inspected before dropping downgrade in either direction. Once Dale Creek is fully in use, trains will roll over this ridge and into the Laramie Valley in a single haul instead of stopping for long delays. The war years taught Dodge that an effective line is not just a strip of iron. It is an entire system of reliable segments. Dale Creek is one of those segments, albeit one that demands more nerve from the men who use it. The signal comes that the locomotive is ready. It stands on the east approach, steam venting into the cold air, rods gleaming where grease has polished them. Behind it are a few loaded cars, enough to represent real service, but not so many that a failure will send an unmanageable mass into the gorge. Men line the banks, some sitting on rocks, others standing with arms folded tight against the wind. A few climb to vantage points on nearby outcrops to watch. Dodge positions himself near the east end of the trestle, where he can see both the engine as it rolls onto the structure and the deck as it flexes under weight. He keeps his face unreadable. His mind runs through the calculations one last time, not in detail but as a habitual check. Span length, timber size, support spacing, load per axle, gust forces at this elevation. Nothing has changed since the drawings were approved and the last inspection finished. The engineer eases the throttle open. The locomotive begins to move with a slow chuff, drivers turning just enough to push the weight forward. The pilot wheels reach the start of the bridge. Steel reports under them with a different note than on solid embankment. As the heavier drivers move out, the entire trestle reacts. There is a noticeable downward motion, then a recovery, like a stiff spring compressing and releasing. The wind catches the high structure, and the combined effect is a slow, unnerving sway that can be felt even from the bank. On the deck, men walk 2 by 2 along the ties, keeping pace with the locomotive. They watch for signs of split timbers, shifting joints, or sudden cracks. Some carry tools ready to tighten a bolt or wedge a brace if something loosens. 8 or 10 feet below the rail level, carpenters stand on platforms, attached to the bents, looking up at the underside of the deck. The sound of the engine echoes off the rock below and the timber around it, filling the gorge with noise. The crossing itself takes only a few minutes, but every second feels longer to the men involved. The locomotive moves in a steady, restrained way. Steam shakes above the stack, torn by the wind. Wheels roll past each joint. There is no sudden drop, no splintering snap, no shudder that would signal failure. When the pilot wheels reach the west bank and the front of the engine finds solid ground again, a wave of relief runs through the onlookers. When the tender and the last car clear the trestle, men on both sides let out the breath they have been holding. Dodge does not allow the moment to become a celebration. He waits until the train stops on the west side, then walks the bridge again. The timber is flexed but not broken. Some joints show signs of slight movement. He orders carpenters to add more diagonal bracing near those points. He instructs the telegraph office at Sherman to enter a standing rule that all trains must cross Dale Creek at slow speed, with no 2 heavy locomotives on the span at the same time. He specifies that track walkers must inspect the bridge deck and bents after each day of traffic and report any changes immediately. In the following days, additional work continues. Where the trestle meets rock, small stone abutments are strengthened. Guy wires are anchored more deeply into the ground and attached to the upper parts of the frame to reduce sway. Crews add more lateral braces at mid-height. During this period of tightening, carpenters sometimes work on small platforms high above the creek, moving along narrow planks without rails or nets. The risk is constant. One misstep or strong gust can send a man tumbling to the rocks below. In that same short span of days, 2 men lose their footing and fall from the structure while trying to add extra bracing. There is no recovering from such a fall at this height. Their bodies are brought up by crews lowered on ropes, then buried near the line with simple markers. Dodge notes their deaths in his reports with the same plain tone he uses for other casualties. The bridge is dangerous to build and to maintain. That fact does not change his decision to use it. The only alternative would be a different route with grades that would cost the railroad in other ways. While Dale Creek crews finish reinforcement, the main construction effort does not stop. Track gangs continue west from the far bank, laying rails across the plateau toward Laramie. The line must reach that town soon, both to fulfill company promises and to secure fresh water and timber. Supplies for this push come up over the summit regularly. Trains labor up the grade from Cheyenne, boilers working hard in the thin air, wheels occasionally slipping on early morning frost. Dodge tracks their performance through daily telegraph reports, watching for any sign that the climb over Sherman is limiting tonnage or speed more than his calculations allowed. The new summit line and the trestle change life in the surrounding region at once. Wagon traffic into the Laramie Valley shifts toward the rail towns. Freighters begin to move goods to and from the tracks rather than hauling everything over mountain roads. Army detachments from Fort D.A. Russell and other posts ride to Sherman and Laramie by train, then scatter on horseback into the plains and hills. Mail, which once took weeks to arrive, now reaches these points in days. Dodge measures these changes not in sentimental terms but as proof that the road is performing its basic function, shortening time and distance. He remains aware that Dale Creek stands as a constant weak point. Whenever heavy winds are reported at Sherman, he sends questions down the wire about how the trestle behaves. Engineers learn to feel the bridge through the locomotive. Some admit that they grip the controls more tightly as they roll onto the span. They obey the speed limit because they know that a higher pace would add force to each joint and amplify every sway. Over time, the crossing becomes routine, but no one treats it casually. On later inspections, Dodge often returns to the site, walking the deck and checking the condition of timber, bolts, and braces. He sees how weather and traffic gradually darken and wear the wood. He reads the maintenance logs that list every tightened nut, replaced plank, and repaired brace. From those, he draws two conclusions. First, the bridge is holding up under the assigned load and rules. Second, it demands constant attention. That is the price of crossing this gap at this elevation, with a wooden trestle built in haste during a race westward. By the end of the construction season of 1868, trains run regularly over Sherman Summit and Dale Creek. Snow begins to fall early at this height. Plows and shovels come into play. Ice forms on rails and deck. The trestle must bear not only the weight of locomotives and cars, but also the added strain of packed snow and freezing moisture in its joints. Dodge issues orders about clearing the bridge promptly and not allowing drifts to build along its length. Even now, with the line in service, he thinks about the structure as an unfinished problem, something to be watched and improved until a more permanent solution can be built. For Grenville M. Dodge, this day in April and the work that followed it mark a new stage in his method. Up to this point, much of the mile-a-day progress has taken place on plains where grading and track work, though hard, followed patterns he had long understood. At Sherman Summit and Dale Creek, the same relentless schedule collides with rock, height, and wind. He responds not by slowing the entire project, but by concentrating special crews and precautions at the critical point while keeping the overall timetable intact. The line over the top of the Laramie Mountain stands as proof that his system can absorb even the most difficult obstacles without losing its forward drive.